All right, I'm here with a boxing historian. Is that fair to describe you as a boxing historian?
Well, I describe boxing historian as an old guy with a good memory, so I guess I qualify under those circumstances. I've been around enough.
All right, Don Majeski. Thank you so much for giving me the honor of interviewing you. I really appreciate you giving me your time.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. Yeah.
All right, so I want to start off first with how'd you get into boxing? Well, what brought you to the sport of boxing?
This is a much told tale. I was, as a kid, had no interest in sports, no interest in boxing. I wanted to be a zoologist. I'll make this as brief as possible. And then I don't know how I got the bug. There was a television show for children in New York called Wonderama, and it was hosted by Sonny Fox. He was a local MC for children's shows, and then he did other things.
Okay.
And one night there was a show on about Joe Louis, and Sonny Fox was the director of the show, and the moderator. And all of a sudden, I said, I thought this was a children's show at night, but it wasn't. It was Joe Louis, Max Schmeling, Jack Sharkey, a number of them, and Joe Walcott, the top fighters he had boxed. And I watched that. And then within a few months, there was I went to the movies and I saw, they had newsreels in those days, the Liston-Patterson fight. So it piqued my interest. And then I remember Clay at that time and Liston. I listened to it in the radio in my mother's bedroom. And then just started getting interested in boxing. And then I sort of segued into it. And I met a couple of guys who did programs. They'd write them and sell them at Madison Square Garden. And we hooked up a guy named Malcolm Flash Gordon and Johnny Bosdahl, named Johnny Boz. He became an agent, and Jack Obermeyer became a writer of all sorts of boxing magazines and contributor. And we hit it off. We'd sell the program. We'd write in the program. I was a teenager. I was 16, 17, still in high school. Then I got a job at Boxing Illustrated through Gil Clancy and Bert Sugar.
How'd you meet Gil Clancy?
Well, we were like gym rats, We were all boxing enthusiasts, as they said. We were read all the magazines, read all the thing. There wasn't any internet in those days, and so we were like-minded. And my friend Johnny Boz, who was from Bay Ridge, he was a fight fan before I was. I started when I was about 16. He probably started when he was 12. And he would go they would take me to the gym. So we went to Telstar Gym, which was on 28th Street and 7th Avenue. Then we go up to Gleason's, which was then in the Bronx at 149th Street and 3rd Avenue.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yes, the funny thing about Gleason's is the Gleason now, Gleason was never in that gym, and Gleason wasn't named Gleason. His name was Gagliardi. So there was no Gleason that ever set foot in the Gleason's gym.
So how did they get the name Gleason's?
Well, Bobby was a fighter. He was born about 1898, and when he turned pro, it was more advantageous to be Irish. So he changed his name from Gallardi to Gleason, his fighting name, and he opened up the gym, and it became Gleason's Gym, and it became famous with Jake LaMotta and later Doug Jones. He managed a featherweight champ, Phil Terranova, who trained there. All the fighters from the Bronx, and there were a lot of them, would work out up at Gleason's Gym before they would go to, let's say, Stillman's or something like that.
Wow, this is I didn't know that about Gleason's. I know Gleason's was in Manhattan at one point, and then it went to Brooklyn. But I didn't know it went from the Bronx to Manhattan to Brooklyn.
Yes, it started at 149th Street, called it the Hub in Bronx, 149th and 3rd Avenue. You go up these stairs, to his gym. It was very active in those days. They had a lot of arenas in the Bronx, too, Starlight Park, so you could stay right in the borough and fight out of there.
Wow.
And LaMotta trained there for a while. When they got bigger, they would go to Stillman's because of the proximity to Madison Square Garden. But yeah, and so it was never Gleason's. It was always Gallardi, but it was named Gleason. And when he moved down, they moved down to the garden off of 31st Street. A guy named Ira Becker took it over.
Yeah, see, that I knew.
Yes.
That I knew. Yeah. Oh, wow. That's so interesting. Getting back to you, is it true you were the youngest writer to ever write for Ring Magazine, or was it Sports Illustrated?
Well, it might have been Boxing Illustrated. So I got a column there. Yes, there was a fellow named Ben Green who used to write a column, and he was a booking agent. You did everything then. You wrote, you were a booking agent, did publicity, and he ran afoul of them. So Bert Sugar hired me in December 1970. So I guess that was my first job. That was just turned 18. And I've been writing for this Flash Gordon. My mom worked for the airline, so I was able to travel. They had a non-rev fare. You just pay the taxes up till I was 21. So I got to travel around. We went on a vacation to California, Los Angeles, and it was 1969, August. And I asked Flash, who had the program, I said, would you do a letter to Mr. Parnassus, was the promoter, George Parnassus, that I'll be your correspondent. So I was out there. I was 16. I looked about 12. And I went into his office in Parkview off of MacArthur Park in L.A. in the Elks building. And it was Oliveras versus Lionel Rose. And I went to the fight. And I sat upstairs. He gave me a pass. He looked at me. "You're the correspondent, the thick Greek accent." I said, "Yes, I am, from New York." "All right, here you go." And I got my binoculars, and I wrote this down as this was the greatest event in the history of mankind since their creation, the most fabulous fight. George Parnassus is the most wonderful promoter ever lived in the history of the world. And when I came back, he gave me 12 pages in the program to write about this fight. Every superlative I could think of, and if I couldn't think of it, I pulled out the thesaurus and pulled that out, and it was the greatest, most wonderful. So then I had an opportunity to go back to California again in February of 1970. I was 17 at the time, and my idol at the time was Jose Napoles, a great Cuban fighter who had to move to Mexico when Castro came in and eliminated professional boxing. And I went out, and I said, "Write another letter. I'm going back out to California." Wrote it, and I saw this George Parnassus sat behind a desk, very impressive. He had the bell from the Dempsey-Tunney fight nearby, all this memorabilia. And I said, "Mr. Parnassus, I know who you are." So I said, "May I get a pair? Here's my letter." I got the letter. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw that story I had written. It would have been the front page of a little program. It was a mimeograph, but Marciano died, so that got the front page, and my 12-page story was relegated to the second page. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw he had that program there. And he gave me he slipped the pass across the table, and it just slipped in my pocket. There was no ticket number, nothing. I went to the Forum in L.A., and if you've been to the Forum, it's so you start at top and you walk your way down. So I was there, and I showed it to the usher. I said, "Where's my seat?" And he said, "Oh, the next level down." I said, "Okay." And then, "Where's my seat?" And I looked, "No, it's next level down." So I said, "Wow, this is where I was last time. This is great. Now I'm going to see Napoles, my idol." And I said, "Here's my," "No, you're next level down." I said, "Oh, man, this is even better than the last time." And I kept going down. I said, "Wow, I'm almost close to the ringside, on the side." And they have the barrier up before you go on the floor, like it was a basketball stadium with a Lakers play. And I'm getting further down, further. I said, "Look, now I'm down just outside the ringside. I'm just the next level. I'll be on the floor." I said, "Where is this seat?" And the guy says, "Oh," he says, "down here." Now I'm on the floor. So I go naturally to the last row in the ringside. Yeah. And I said, "Okay, this is going to be great, unbelievable." No, further up. No, nobody can find the seat. The fight's ready to start. I'm behind the ring, and I'm looking around for the seat, befuddled, and George Parnassus is walking this way. I'm walking that way. I said, "Mr. Parnassus, where's my seat?" "What? My seat? Your seat?" And he pulls out a folding chair, and he shoves it right on the ring. He says, "There's your seat." In 15 rounds, Jose Napoles, my idol, I was in heaven, and I never looked back.
Wow, that's an amazing story. So you sat literally
on the ring. Yes.
And what fight was this again?
Jose Napoles versus Ernie Red Lopez. And remember, I idolized Napoles for like 5 years.
Is that video like so? Like in the fight, you can see yourself.
Maybe I haven't looked to check, but I'm right there. And the interesting thing behind me was John Hall. He was the sports editor of the L.A. Herald Examiner, and Jim Murray, who was the he won the Pulitzer Prize with the L.A. Times.
Yeah.
And Murray was a sarcastic guy, and I hear him say to Hall, "Who the hell is this kid?" And John Hall says, "He must be the son of the owner."
All right.
Yeah, was it.
What attract? Well, I want to get into Jose Napoles, but first I want to ask you what attracted you to him, and then I want to get into who he was and what's his legacy and so on. But what attracted you to Jose Napoles?
Well, we used to read the Ring magazine, and they had what they called agate type. So you'd follow a fighter. You never saw him. But I would read about him. There were 3 fights. Him, Jose Legra. They were all Latin Americans, interestingly enough. And Nicolino Loche. And I was reading about these. And they'd be winning and winning and winning, but they would never fight for the championship. I think Legra had 90 wins. I think Napoles was undefeated for 7 years. And Loche was like on a 50-win bout streak. I said, "Why aren't these guys fighting for the title?" Now I was 14, 15, just trying to figure out what's going on there. And, and so I got familiar with it. And then I used to write letters to Teddy Brenner at the Garden. "Why don't you bring in Jose Napoles? Why don't you bring in Jose Legra? Why don't, they always have these heavyweights." In fact, to go back to my original story, when I met these 3 guys who were boxing mavens, and there weren't a lot in the 60s, I heard them talking at ringside, because I would write the letters, "Why no flyweights?" And it was a fight, Chuck Wepner and Jerry Tomasetti, December of '68. And as I'm watching this fight from the balcony, in what was called the Felt Forum. Now it's the Hulu. I hear these guys saying, yeah, why don't they bring in a flyweight and a bantamweight? Why we got to watch these guys? Chuck Wepner, it's a dinosaur. And I said, hey, this is music to my ears. And we struck up a conversation, became friendly. My first boxing match that I ever went to was interesting. In '66, where I really got the bug, there was, for the first time since 1959, they televised, no, 57 in fact, they televised a heavyweight championship fight on live, not having to go to the closed circuit like it used to do. And it was Muhammad Ali versus Henry Cooper on Telstar Satellite, May of '66. And that night they had in Shea Stadium, Jose Torres defending his light heavyweight title against Wayne Thornton. And you couldn't get in as you were a kid if you had to be 14 or over. And I was not quite 13. I made my mother take me, so she brought a ticket and brought me to Shea Stadium. There were only 5,500 people there at the time. And I must have known I was going into business. It wasn't the kind of business to go into if you brought 5,000 people in a 50,000 seat stadium. But that hooked me. Then I met these guys, and then we had like-mindedness. Yeah, we wanted to see all these great fighters in different weight classes. And the Garden was primarily concentrating on heavyweights and middleweights. So it sort of piqued my interest, just saying, why was this great fighter? Make a list and make your own ratings and stuff.
Okay.
And then he just, somebody I idolized. And then when he, that was the first time I saw him fight. He was on that, the old Spanish language Channel 47 used to run boxing matches.
Telemundo?
Yeah, Telemundo. And then there was one before that preceded that. Univision.
Yeah.
Out of Mexico.
Yes.
So I saw Annapolis fight. He boxed. The rematch with Curtis Coates was in Mexico City. They televised that. And then he fought a boxer named Fate Davis. So I'd seen him, but it was a grainy image. It wasn't the best thing. Channel 41, you had to move the antenna all around.
So tell me about Napoles, who he was. I know he was from Cuba, and I know he lived in Mexico and fought out of Mexico. Could you tell me just one, how great he was, why he moved, what was his amateur career? Anything you know about that?
Well, he was a great. I became then great friends with his manager, Cuco Conde. He was a legendary fellow. He was the manager of the Tropicana Casino in Havana. Great sports writer, broadcaster in baseball, but he also was involved in boxing. He had worked for Pincho Gutierrez, who was the manager of Kid Chocolate, the first great Cuban fighter to come to America and get worldwide attention and become champion. And Montequilla Napoles, they call him, that was smooth as butter for the English language people, right? And he was in a stable with the Baby Luis, who was a great bantamweight, Sugar Ramos, who became featherweight champ, himself, Florentino Fernandez, and another fighter, Doug Vaillant, who went on to fight for the light weight championship of the world, and then Louis Rodriguez as well.
Okay.
All right. So Napoles was the Cuban fighters at that time were more noted as their boxing abilities, slick boxers, beautiful. They were great technicians.
Still to this day, that's how they're known.
Yes, but Sugar Ramos was a slugger, and so was Florentino Fernandez. And Montequilla, though, the style is smooth as butter, and he was winning and losing in Cuba. He beat a couple of good fighters, Bunny Grant. And then when Castro came in, and I've never had this explained to me properly, why they wouldn't allow professional boxing. You could be a bus driver, you could be a cab driver, you could be a carpenter, but what? Boxing's a profession like anything else. I don't understand what were the prohibition. But anyway, they eliminated professional boxing about 1960, and then they made a move to Mexico. Cuco Conde had a relationship with Pancho Rosales, who was the most famous of the Mexican managers. They've been going there for years, exchanging boxers, coming to Cuba, going to Mexico. And they moved out. They went there rather than to Miami. They felt that because at the time, with the language barrier, it would have been easier to transition into Mexico. And so when Napoles went there, he was just establishing himself at that time. And he was in the shadow of Sugar Ramos, who was about a year or two older than him.
Okay.
And he was boxing. He won. He lost a fight or so. And they said, you've got to change your style. You're a good boxer, but the Mexicans like sluggers. They like knockout punches. And he basically said, well, I could punch, but I really didn't emphasize that because, I was winning there.
His style.
Yeah, the style of all the guys. You see the guys in the gym, and by osmosis, you pick up that type of way of boxing. So they adjusted him to be a knockout puncher, and then he started knocking out all these contenders. There was a famous fight where he lost a controversial decision to a Mexican fighter named Alfredo Urbina. And after that, Napoles said, that sort of made it for me. And he went into the rematch, and he knocked him out in one round. And that sort of started him out. And he was the top #1 lightweight contender for Carlos Ortiz. He had beaten, as I said, Napoles had beaten Angel Robinson Garcia and Urbina and he had beaten Bunny Grant, who was the top contender, but they couldn't get a fight because they couldn't generate the money for him to get the title fight. And then he moved up to 140 pounds, and he beat Carlos Morocho Hernandez, a great puncher, knocked him out in Venezuela, which was Hernandez's home country.
Okay.
And then he outpointed...
For a title? For a title?
No, he couldn't get the title. This is before, ironically, Morocho went on to win the title after that.
Oh, okay.
And then he beat Eddie Perkins, who was the junior welterweight champ, and he was the #1 contender there and couldn't get a title fight. Then he fought L.C. Morgan. He got a cut eye. They stopped the fight, so he lost his position. But he bounced right back and beat Morgan. So he was #1 contender in 2 divisions, lightweight and junior welter. Still couldn't get a title fight, even though he'd beaten 2 former champs. Mm-hmm. So then they moved him up to welterweight. And he had turned pro about 1958, and this was getting into the mid-60s. And George Parnassus, who's a great manager, he managed Seferino Garcia, Enrique Bolaños, and then he became matchmaker for the Olympic Auditorium, and then a promoter on his own. He came back and made a deal to promote in the Forum as a competitor to the Olympic Auditorium, where his former employer, Eileen Eaton, was still going.
Okay.
And when Parnassus came along, he brought Napoles in on the first show. He won by knockout in 1 round over a fighter from Philadelphia, Leroy Roberts, and he impressed the fans. And finally had a guy like Parnassus who was willing to put up the money to bring the champion. And they had offered Curtis Coates at the time $50,000, which was pretty good in 1968 to fight Napoles. He turned it down. Then he went to 60, then he went to 70, and they finally got him to come in for $80,000. And Napoles got his chance, and he won. He stopped Curtis Coates, another Hall of Famer, in the 13th round. But one of the preconditions was he had to give Coates a rematch within 90 days, which is almost unheard of. They figured Napoles would party afterwards, but he went back in and fought in Mexico City and stopped him a second time, and then beat Emil Griffith that year, and then beat Ernie Red Lopez, the #1 contender, in February. So within 8 months, he had beaten Coates twice, Griffith, and Ernie Red Lopez. He was a truly great fighter.
Wow. And in 8 months, he has whatever 5, 6 fights.
Yes.
Now, guys fighting once or twice a year. It's such a difference as to what's happening now as to what was happening then. What's your opinion on the activity of the fighters currently?
Yeah, I think they should be more active. You know, to bring up again about Napoles, he turned pro in 58, didn't get a world title fight till 1969. It was 11 years, and he's fighting the best fighters in the world. His manager explained, you know, it's not just getting the fight. It's the disappointment. He beats a guy, Hernandez, who goes on and wins the world title. He beats a guy who was world champ. He's sitting there #1, and he can't get the frustration they have to deal with. And today, you go in, you either win or lose. You're a winner or a loser within, a half a dozen fights. You're marked winner or you're marked loser. And if you go through the box rec, where they have a listing of the ratings and the records of the fighters, you see 60% of the fighters are undefeated, and 40% have a bunch of losses. And the same 40% have lost to all those undefeated fighters, so they have the records. You build a record today. It's not trial and error where a loss, yes, it's not ending your career. It's a setback, but you just don't give up. These guys like Napoles or Emil Griffith or Eddie Perkins, they lose a fight, but a month later they come back and win. They eradicate it and just keep fighting and fighting. Today it's like an all or nothing thing. They want to become millionaires or they want to fight at all. It's not a job. It's a profession.
Yeah. I agree with you in that sense that a lot of times the business gets in the way of the sport of boxing, and I understand that this is a business, but a lot of times one fighter be with one promoter, another fighter be with another one, or the other fighter is clearly the #1 guy, but they're making excuses as to not to fight him because he doesn't sell tickets and he's not worth the risk versus the reward. And there's a lot of that goes on now, which is somewhat disappointing. And hearing a story like this where a guy fights top contenders for 11 years,
and doesn't get a title fight,
doesn't get a title shot, it's crazy. And he fought when there was just one belt at the time?
There was one champion at the time, and he made 13 defenses of the title. He went up to Syracuse, fought Billy Backus. He lost, and that's another story. But it took 6 months to get the rematch. He knocked him out, and then he came back and went on right on the tear. He beat Hedgeman Lewis. He beat Lopez again. He beat Adolph Pruitt. He beat Ralph Charles. He beat Roger Menetre. Went through all the top contenders. And in between those fights, he would fight non-title fights. So they would be fighting all the time, and he's not an exception to the rule. Emil Griffith, was fighting all of the time, and and these were great fights. They didn't worry about having a pristine record or losing. promotional rights have taken a lot away. When I started in the business, and again, I sound like a 100-year-old man, but I've been around, I've never done anything but boxing, and I've starved many a time. I know what having the lights and the phone shut off is like. But I started, I guess, right out of high school, so that article I wrote was 1969, and I've been in boxing ever since. So either it was writing for a magazine or a publicist or matchmaker. So it's a hard profession. But yeah, you didn't have promotional rights. It wasn't never meant to be a team sport. So the manager had a fighter. He could box for any promoter he wanted. And when I made matches early, I could call anybody and say, okay, I want you to fight.
So everyone was like an independent contractor?
Yes, that's correct. Now, of course, you'd be tied to your place. If you were a New York fighter, there was a kid here, Frank DePaula, who was a very popular light heavyweight. Of course, he was going to draw more money from Jersey City if you fought in the Garden than if he went to California or Chicago. And if Armando Ramos was in L.A., yeah, he'd have a name. He could come to New York or Chicago. But he was locked into L.A. That's where his fan base was. He's a Mexican-American fighter. And if you were an Irish kid in Boston, so you were locked in. So you didn't really need a contract with the promoter, because where else were you going to go unless there was another promoter in the same town? But by and large, you didn't need that because you were going to fight out of Philly if you were a Philly fighter, or New York. The Garden was an exception. That was like Broadway. The biggest stars or Carnegie Hall would come to New York. Yeah. But you'd always have the hometown affiliation, which has died, So you have an unsung thing. You could have contracts with a promoter, but it wasn't like it's now. The promoter now has ostensibly become a manager.
Yeah.
Where you want his rights, you got to pay them to get the rights. But if I want a fighter, was saying, if I go to Top Rank or I go to the Zone with Eddie Hearn, and I know them well, say, I'd like your fighter to box my guy in Montreal or in Philadelphia or San Antonio. And they will say to me, Don, our fighters are not really contracted to us. They're contracted to the Zone or to ESPN. For us to take our fighter off there and let him fight your guy off television on a non-affiliated promotion, we would have problems with our TV network, who's basically financed it. So instead of getting the fighter for $100,000, where you maybe could make it up at the gate, now it's $200,000 because they need to have a compensation for their promotion as well as the purses for the fighter. Wow. So that's why you don't see really good competitive matches on the way up, because it's virtually impossible to do that. And I've worked with many fighters and champions, and it's almost impossible to do it any longer.
Man, that's so unfortunate that things are like that. But let's hope things get better. I wanted to ask you, you used to work for Don King?
Oh, yes, I did. 1974, 75. I signed Monzon, Galindez, John Conti. I brought him Arguello, and then the first contact with Duran, yeah.
Really?
Yeah. I was getting $175 a week, so yeah.
Well, how did you get that gig, and how did you scout these fighters? These are some Hall of Famers you just mentioned.
Right. Well, remember, I was a mad fan at the time. So I when I worked for Bert Sugar, then after I lost the airfare, he made me the Latin American correspondent for Boxing Illustrated. I spoke a little bit of Spanish, and again, 50 years ago, not a lot of people spoke Spanish. I think there were 3 Mexican restaurants in New York at the time. Now there's 1,000. Now there's carts selling Mexican food on every corner. Yeah. So I got to travel to Argentina. I met Monzon and Galindez and his promoter Tito Lectori, and with Cuco Conti in Mexico, and George Parnas, Ruben Oliveras. So I had a connection with all these guys. I saw Duran fight many times in Panama when he defended the title with Jimmy Robertson and De Jesus and
did you know
Suzuki.
When you saw Duran for the first time, did you know right away, like, all right, this is like elite level type talent when you saw him?
Well, he came to New York. I didn't see him before he was champ. He came to New York, was very highly touted. He scored, and he fought on the, it's interesting, fights make fights. Ali made the comeback, and he came to New York in the second fight at the fought Quarry in October, and then came back and fought Bonavena December 7th of 1970. And he was the big attraction. The semifinal was a French-Canadian fight. Well, he's an Italian living in Montreal. Donato Paduano had a great following. He was the Golden Glove champ. And Ken Buchanan just upset Ismael Laguna. So they brought him to the Garden. The guys who want to come to the Garden, it's like you make a hit, you want to go to the Garden. And he fought Paduano. Well, it was a mixed weight match. It was over the weight, at welterweight, and they figured Paduano was going to beat this guy, lightweight champ. And he boxed the ears off him. When everybody left that arena, they were not talking about Ali and Bonavena. They were all talking about Ken Buchanan. 6 months later, he comes in, he defends his title against Laguna in the rematch. And everybody's going to be talking about Laguna and Buchanan. No. Roberto Duran comes in and fights a tough Puerto Rican guy, Benny Huertas, who had scored 3 good wins in a row. And Duran knocks him out in 66 seconds. And leaving the arena, everybody's talking about Duran. And 9 months later, he fights Buchanan and wins the title. So he was highly touted coming in, but I don't think anybody at that time anticipated him being like maybe the greatest fighter or among the greatest fighters of all time. Yeah. But he did have a reputation. He solidified it. And then, of course, he literally ran Buchanan out of the ring and won that. But the ironic thing is the first fight he had back, which caused bad relations with Teddy Brenner, because he always wanted to make he had a saying, I never would make a match that I didn't want to watch or that both sides didn't have a chance to win. And he put him in with Esteban de Jesus. And Roberto had a manager, Carlos Aleta, a very wealthy man. He owned Air Panama and many businesses. He had him as a hobby. He brought Ray Arcel back into boxing, the great trainer, and he had him train Duran. Right?
I know who's Ray Arcel.
Yes. And then Freddie Brown was the corner man. And anyway, Brenner had him fight de Jesus. Said, well, we don't fight. That's a tough fight. Roberto's not in great shape. Just give us, I'm guaranteeing he'll win, no question. And then he lost. And Aleta always held that against Brenner. And he wanted the rematch with Buchanan. If you notice, he never gave him the rematch. Not because he wouldn't fight him, but because he wouldn't fight him for Brenner. And they offered to do it in Panama, and Buchanan turned that fight down. But, yeah, after the first fight, after we saw him fight in Panama, knocked out Jimmy Robertson, then he knocked out, I think, Ishimatsu Suzuki, and the rematch with de Jesus, you said this is a great, great fighter.
So how did you manage to position yourself to get to sign him?
Oh, well, what happened was, or at least I made the contact with King. You know, Mickey Duff was a matchmaker, and I said, when I went into the business, I said, I don't know, you think people want me to succeed? He says, yes, they want to succeed, but not too much, you know, a lot of jealousy. But I said, what's it, having a hard time? He says, Don, when you started out, you were writing for a magazine, and you were doing publicity. So what are you doing in the magazine? Roberto Duran is the greatest fighter. George Parnassus is the greatest promoter. Carlos Aleta, the greatest manager. Jose Napoles is the greatest welterweight who ever lived. Carlos Monzon is a phenomenon. The promoter is the most wonderful human being on earth. But now you're dealing with their pocketbook. You're saying, I can pay you this much to fight, not that much. You got to fight this guy, not that guy. Now you're in their business. You're not telling them how great and wonderful they are. You're not giving them. You're trying to make a living out of them. You're telling them how much you can pay them or get them paid. So now you're doing with business. But since I started out as the PR and hadn't been doing business, so I had a very friendly relationship with Tito Lattori, the promoter from Argentina. So he allowed me to bring Monzon and Galindez to fight here in the Garden for Don King.
Okay.
The manager of Roberto Duran was very friendly. I said, look, I have Don King wants to work with you. Alexis Arguello's manager. All of these guys I was able to get in. John Conte I'd known from England, you know, and he was looking for a promoter. So, you know, again, I had a great friendly relationship because I wasn't telling you can't get this, you can't get that, this is a bad fight. I was just praising them and being friendly. And it still lasted. I mean, I had a good relationship with all of them even afterwards.
With Don King, a lot it gets made about, you know, how he did business. You know, a lot of people criticize. Did you ever see anything shady or hear of anything from like a legit source of something he did that maybe you wouldn't have approved of?
I'll tell you this. When I first worked with him, he had just started. The first time I met Don King, again, I would hang around Madison Square Garden's office, like sitting here. You'd be Teddy Brenner or Harry Markson or Duke Stefano. They were the promoters for the Garden. And then people would come in and out, everybody with a fighter, and I'd sit there like all day long, like a learning experience, you know, or I'd write a column or they'd give me a job doing publicity for a show or I'd help book a fighter. But I was just in there all the time. And the first time Don King came into the office, the first time we laid eyes on him, he had run an exhibition with Muhammad Ali in Cleveland for a hospital, a benefit. And he had to fight a Jeff Merritt. And King walked in the office. Jerry Quarry was supposed to fight a rematch with Jimmy Ellis. I think this was about 1970. And Ellis had beaten Quarry in the WBA tournament. And Brenner was bringing the rematch there. And all of a sudden, Quarry injured himself, and he pulled out. So they needed a substitute, and they got through Don Elbaum, who's been around he's about 94.
Yes,
right?
I've spoken with Don Elbaum, yes.
Super hustle. Well, he actually discovered Don King. He brought him into the boxing as an investor. Well, with Don Elbaum, you invested one way. You lost, and he won. You know? So he was a one-way investor. He didn't know Don King. That was another like a Roberto, and nobody thought there was a revelation that Don King was going to be what he became. And he came in tow of Don Elbaum. And a big guy with this, you know, hair shot up. I mean, he was something that stood out. And here's L-Bomb, who we all knew, and here's King. And King was spouting, quoting Shakespeare and Homer and T.S. Eliot and, invoking everybody and everything. And he was colorful, obviously. Mm-hmm. And Shavers came in, and I turned to Teddy Brenner and said, about how long do you think this guy will be in boxing? And he said, and he's very cynical, about as long as it takes to somebody to hit Ernie Shavers on the chin. Well, Shavers won by knockout in 1 round. And that set up a quarry fight for December, which sold out the Garden. And he was telling King, Don, Brenner, you and I are together no matter what, win, lose, or draw, we're together. This is a link, don't worry about Shavers, you're going to have other fighters. And Quarry knocked him out in 1 round, and I'll never forget this. We were in the hallway of the Garden, in the vestibule where you have the dressing rooms. King is standing there, and the reporters are crowding around Brenner. Of course, Quarry was the story with 1 round knockout. And all they were thinking of making Quarry and Foreman at the time. That was a mega fight.
Yeah.
And Brenner, Quarry this, and we'll sell out. We'll put it in Yankee Stadium. And King there innocently said, what about Ernie Shavers? And Brenner turned, Shavers? Who's Ernie Shavers? And you could see the look on King's face change. And it's, I'll show you. And with that point, he turned into promotion. And he set up Foreman and Joe King Roman, and then Foreman and Norton, and he became the most prominent promoter in the world. Well, I went to work for the right before the Chuck Wepner fight that they did, when Ali had won the title. I was in Zaire for the fight, as covering it for the magazine, and we got to know each other through Patty Flood and Al Brave. Patty Flood actually was a manager that became close with King. And in those days, he was like, we'll pay more than anyone else, and a lot of it his own money. So he was like naive to very idealistic. I want to be the biggest promoter. Make me big, he would shout and yell. Mm-hmm. We had an office on the 67th floor of Rockefeller Center, right near Radio City. Make me big. And when we paid Monzon, he gave him $175,000 to fight Tony Licata.
Wow.
And Victor Galindez. And this is not in the days of $1 million TV deals. It was a closed circuit show. Yeah. We had the 2 of them fight, Galindez and Almada, Licata and Monzon in the Garden live. And on the closed circuit was Ali and Joe Bugner from Malaysia. So I ran the show in the Garden for him. And, so, he was like, we outbid everyone else. He got Duran because he paid him more money than anyone else. But then what happened, I think King saw, and Larry Holmes was just in his nation form. He was coming up as a 6 and 8 round fighter. But, cynicism comes in. You do things with fighters, and then they leave you. Promoters undermine you. So I think the reality set in with King. And they said, you can't let these fighters fight for you one time and they walk away. You got to get promotional rights. So
was he the first to start signing fighters exclusively?
Well, I think Aram started with that. The Garden used to be able to do it, but they broke them up as a monopoly and they couldn't legally do it. Okay. So what happened is when television came back in the 70s, there was a glut there. TV was saturating the market in the 40s. At one point in the 50s, there were 6 nationally televised shows on boxing every week. Unbelievable. Every night you had boxing in prime time with only 3 networks. There were 40 million people watching these fights. It was unbelievable. Oversaturation.
Wow.
So by 1964, they were down to 1 ABC with a weekly show. And then that ended and they went to syndication. But what revived, that's why when I got to see the Ali Cooper fight, it was on Wide World of Sports, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Mm-hmm. It was in England, so they could do it live there and bring it back here. But when the Olympic team came around in the 70s, they always had Wide World of Sports. But again, these were relegated to Saturday afternoon, nothing to think of at prime time. But they revived the interest. Ali winning the title back again, and that Olympic team coming up in 76. And then we were flooded. CBS signed Howard Davis, the Olympic gold medalist. Yes. ABC signed Sugar Ray Leonard. And they just needed fights, and there were fights coming back. But when promoters came in, like Bob Arum, he didn't have an arena like Madison Square Garden, the Olympic. Yeah. So what they did have were these television contracts. So you basically signed your TV rights away to them. So they started signing fighters without a place to put them, like without a set location, but they had your TV rights. So then that became the idea. And the promoters in Europe and Asia had something called an option. So if you would fight for the world title, you would have to give up. I'll give you the chance for the title, but I want 3 options on your next 3 fights, which I could subcontract to another promoter. So I might have the option. You would buy it off of me to put them on, and then they get options on your fight, like the reserve clause. Okay. And then American promoters picked that up. They didn't even know what it was. Teddy Brenner had a lot of problems with the WBC because he didn't notice the business had changed. It wasn't what it was when he came around in the 1930s, 40s. And, It was a different
It's a
business.
different game,
yes.
especially with the sanction and body game. It definitely makes it a different game. Can you share any funny Don King stories or funny Bob Arum stories, maybe throughout your encounters with them?
Gosh, I have a lot of stories. I'm trying to think funny ones. I'll have to, as I said, when King came in, it was all about, money, and they would gush. It would come in with a suitcase full of cash, to impress these guys.
Okay.
And of course, they'd sign. He'd give a guy $10,000 $1 bills, and a guy would look at that, and the guy said, well, I'm giving you a check for $20,000. No, but this is cash, and that's how he would impress guys. He had that street mentality where he knew how to do it. And Bob Arum and Don King Herbert Muhammad was a brilliant guy. He had Muhammad Ali.
Yes.
And of course he kept him a free agent. So he would, always play Arum against King and Arum and King against Madison Square Garden. They were the three big promoters. So if you look throughout his career, you would see he'd have a fight for Arum, a fight for King, a fight for the Garden, and whoever gave him the most, that's where he would end up.
Oh, he's a good negotiator.
Oh, yeah. So Arum and King would run up to Herbert, and they'd make a deal, and he'd have a place on Central Park South, and I think King bought him an apartment, and then Arum would offer to buy him a car, and the guys at the Garden would be frustrated. They said, look, we can't do that. We're a public corporation. What can we do? How do we compete with that? We can only offer him tradition,
That's so funny. Speaking of Muhammad Ali, talk to me about living that moment of, when he was Cassius Clay, him winning the title, and all of a sudden he says he's Muhammad Ali, and he's a Muslim. And at the time, being Muslim was something different in America. And
oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And he was shadowing Malcolm X. And what was that like, as a boxing fan, seeing this guy become world champion and all of a sudden change his name? And almost at the time, looking back, we look back at it different. But at the time, people felt like he was un-American. I feel like that was the tone that was around him at that time. Can you talk to me about that time?
Yeah, well, he's obviously an amazing character. And when the Liston fight came off, of course, Liston was perceived as another Joe Louis. He was invincible. But Liston, unfortunately, people didn't realize, and I also idolized. I always idolized the outcast, Annapolis, the guys who couldn't get the chance. I was big on meritocracy. And Liston turned pro in '53. And if you compare his career to Floyd Patterson was a guy that the oceans parted when he went to the shore. And with Liston, the tidal wave came and wiped over him. Floyd turns pro the same time. He's 21. He's the world champ. Liston turns pro in '53. He goes 10 years without getting a title fight. Yeah. And he beats every contender, blows them out on the way of Foley and Machin and Cleveland Williams, Nino Valdez, you name it, Wayne Bethea. And Patterson's there fighting a guy like Rademacher who never even had a pro fight, hand-picking his guys, making $250,000. Liston's fighting for 10. So he went through everything to get that title, and he knocks out Patterson twice in defense, once to win it. Unprecedented, one round. And nobody gave then Cassius Clay a chance. He was perceived as not as a gimmick so much. He was the Olympic champ, but a guy was a fresh face. He was clever. He was witty. He was bombastic.
He was a gold medalist too.
Gold medal, right? Yeah. Great sell, but against Liston, this guy, no way on earth did he have a chance. And when he starts winning, I'm listening on the radio, and the tide turned, and as he's winning, Liston he's bleeding. He's cut under his eyes. And then there was a round where Ali or Clay, he had some liniment got in his eyes and he couldn't see. Well, now Liston's going to kill him, but he legitimately beat him in the first fight. And then again to announce this is the '60s again. We were starting to change, but we hadn't gotten to the radicalization that he's a black Muslim. It'd be like Jackie Robinson signing with the Dodgers and announcing the next day, I just want to announce to you that I'm a communist. It would be. It
was like that level of
that. Yes, or I'm a homosexual, saying,
Okay.
What, and then go on to play,
Okay.
Inconceivable. But I always had a theory that Ali, Nat Fleischer, who he admired and was like Mr. Boxing, whether it was deserved or not, rated Jack Johnson as the #1 heavyweight of all time. One of the few people that ever did.
Okay.
And he was living in the past. I mean, he he ignored everyone. Never put Ali in the top 10. But and then, Robinson was number 6, and other guys fought in 1890 were number 2. But having said that, I think it imprinted on Ali about Jack Johnson. He was ostracized. He married a white prostitute. He was taken. They convicted him of the Mann Act. Incredible racism against Johnson. We're talking 1907, 1908, 1910. And in some way, I think Ali, he felt himself the incarnation. If he had gone with a white woman, it really was, at that point, it might have been controversial, but you were not going to be thrown out of society because of it at that stage of the game. So, like, he went to the most extreme. He became a Muslim, which people perceived as like a hate group.
At the time.
At the time, yes. I mean, there were pictures or the film with Malcolm X giving a rally, and the head of the Ku Klux Klan was sitting in there because they basically had the same ideas, separatists, one is anti-black, one is anti-white, separate but equal. If you want to do that, fine, but let's be separate. And so it was kind of crazy, and they didn't even know what it was. If you look in old magazines, they spelled Muhammad 16 different ways, M-O, M-H, M-U, M-I. I mean, nobody knew what it was. It was so alien to people.
Okay.
And so they get rid of Liston, who's this ex-felon and had that kind of reputation, and they replace him with a black Muslim that people say, my God, what's this? It's like a communist. The communists endorsed him. I said, oh my God. So he does that, but he was so charming. He's had a lot of racist things when he was there, and it was, whether it was justified or not, you could see this. He had a lot of anger in him, and he had a lot of fury that he was speaking on behalf of maybe a lot of people who couldn't speak. But he was so compelling as a personality. But I'll tell you, the original incarnation, there was a lot of alienation, obviously. When he won the title, if you recall, after the Patterson fight, he sort of self-exiled himself. The next fights were in England and in Germany. He comes back and fights. Then the draft situation comes back. But by the time he comes back, there's a book, The Greening of America.
But before we get to that, what was your opinion on him being stripped of his title for not participating in the war? What was your opinion at the time, and now looking back, what's your opinion on it?
Well, it's interesting because all of the organizations, in retrospect, the WCC said we didn't strip him, but they really did. The New York Commission, the American commissions did. Okay, he didn't have the passport; he had to give that up, and then the WBA, which was previously the National Boxing, was really an American organization with some international affiliates.
I got you.
Okay. And then the WBC, he announced his retirement before the Jimmy Ellis and Frazier fight, although he never stopped trying to get back into the ring, They never knew what was happening. But what happened, the political climate changed. I was bringing it up between 1967, the fought Foley, I was at that fight, and 1970, when he made the comeback, there was a big sea change in the attitude towards Vietnam. And then, so the WBC, actually, Frazier fought for that title, but when he beat Ali, it was finally the real incarnation of his champion. But, I don't know. Look, if they hadn't stripped, forget the political ramifications, it was almost impossible. He wasn't being able to be licensed in the States. He couldn't travel. So what do you say, Ali? You do have problems, whether legitimate or what. They say they broke the law. All right, and he ended up winning in Supreme Court. You're depriving other guys of fighting for the championship. So there I might have agreed, saying, look, he's going to battle him out in court. That may take years, which it did. What about guys like Joe Frazier who want to fight but they can't fight the champ? I understand it.
Who's an all-time great.
Yeah, and then Jimmy Ellis and the other guys, So on that technicality, I'd say they were right. See, now what happens if a fighter is injured medically, or if he's got a court situation, they'll say, look, we'll make you champ in recess, or we'll do something.
Interim. They'll make the other person an interim champion or something like that.
There's too many of them. But the original intent of that was to say you can't, for legal or physical reasons, box. We can't deprive somebody else from fighting for the championship. But when you're finished with that, you can come right back and you can fight,
Yeah. No, for sure. Since you worked with Don King, and we'll get into the relationship you have with the WBC currently, Don King and Jose Sulaiman seem to have a really good relationship back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Can you talk to me about that relationship and how that happened and what they would do for each other?
Well, I would say Jose Sulaiman was maybe my best friend, and that goes beyond the boxing because he and I would fight. 99.9% of every fight or argument I ever had with Jose Sulaiman was over Don King. So Don King was in one corner. He was a heavyweight, and I was in the other corner. I was a flyweight.
Okay.
So it was an uneven match, but I was like a nemesis. I was a gadfly, I guess a better word than nemesis.
A nemesis to
Don King.
To Don King. Okay.
So Sulaiman and I'll tell you, most of the things, I would always fight with Sulaiman to enforce the rules. You know, I'll go by the book. These are the rules. They may not be popular rules, but they're your rules.
His son is the exact same way, by the way. Okay. We got to fight to him to get enforced those rules.
That's it. Don King would always ask him to make an exception to the rules. So what would happen is he'd make the exception to help King, and then the promoter, for who was not the beneficiary of that, but the one who suffered from it, would take the WBC to court. They said, you broke the rules to help Don King. We don't want you to break. Just enforce the rules. If you're enforcing rules and goes against me, I'll live with it. I may disagree with it. I'll live with it. But he's asking you to break the rules to help him out. And what happened is Jose Sulaiman had a philosophy, must always be with the biggest promoter. Well, his idea was, I want the biggest fights with the biggest fighters for my organization. Mm-hmm. So I like when they stripped with Ali, that wouldn't have happened today. He would have let Ali fight because he did strip Leon Spinks when they did the rematch. Mm-hmm. So Arum had been a bigger promoter than King. Was losing a bit of his grip, and Arum was the primary promoter. Ali had been through he swung back. The pendulum with Herbert Muhammad and Ali had swung back to Arum after the fights of Evangelista. Then, if you recall, Ali fought Ernie Shavers for Bob Arum and the Madison Square Garden. Mm-hmm. And then his next fight was Leon Spinks, which was for Arum. Yeah, so the pendulum swam back, and King had him for Jimmy Young and other fights. Mm-hmm. So Arum was getting the primary situation. So Ali, King signed Ken Norton. Ken Norton was the top contender. They had 3 fights, all controversial. Ali lost the first, won the second, and won the third. And Norton was back to being number 1 contender. So they ordered, Norton had fought Jimmy Young, elimination, with the fact that if Ali and Spinks did not fight the winner of that bout, they would declare the winner of the match between Norton and Young retroactively the world champ. I worked with Lennox Lewis, went through a similar thing with Lewis and Razor Ruddock. In any event. Yeah. So now King is pressuring Sulaiman to put on the fight. And he can't fight Leon Spinks. He's got to fight Ken Norton. He's got to do this. And Arum and Rodolfo Sabatini, a promoter from Italy, was his great associate. They said to Sulaiman, this is Muhammad Ali. This is an easy fight with Spinks. He has 7 fights or 8 fights. He'll take him, and then we'll fight Norton right after. You got to let it go, this and that. So he did. King was furious about this. But you promised me, well, if it doesn't happen, I will go ahead and the winner must fight. They signed a contract or an agreement. They must fight. Well, nobody, and I'm sure Arum included, thought that Leon Spinks was going to beat Ali. But what had happened is when you start to slip, he slipped a little. It was a close fight against Norton. It was a close fight against Shavers. And a very close fight with Jimmy Young that could have gone either way. And finally, I think the judges subconsciously, well, you know what, we gave you 3 in a row on a pass. The next close fight, the other guy's going to win. Okay. So Leon Spinks beat him. He legitimately did, but he was a bigger long shot than Ali was fighting Liston or Foreman. Like
really?
100 to 1. Well, Leon, when he fought Ali, it was 100 to 1. Wow, nobody. He'd come off a draw with Scott Ledoux prior to that fight. So okay. Nobody was giving him a chance. He could beat Alfio Righetti, but it was a show. Mm-hmm. And that was in March, and it was at the Hilton. Well, of course, he beats him. Now, the biggest fight in the world of all time is the rematch, the third fight. Could Ali win a title for a third? It was never done before, unprecedented. And Arum said, you got to allow the rematch. No, he has to fight Norton. And King was, you've got to do that, and you've got to allow that fight. We waited 2 years, this and that. So Arum, to thwart him, he said, all right, look, I'll make an offer to Norton, a low ball offer, $250,000, when the fight was probably worth $2.5 million, to fight Spinks, which Norton's people felt they were surely going to beat Leon Spinks. But Arum had a fight that was going to draw, they wanted to put it in Yankee Stadium, they wanted to put it in New Orleans, they wanted to put it in, everybody was vying for this fight. Mm-hmm. And they said, we'll make him an offer, he'll turn it down, then we'll fight Spinks. We'll give you $250,000. And Norton said, no, we'll take it. What? Yeah, we'll take it, let's go, make the match. We want the fight because they felt for sure. Yeah. So Aram's bluff was called. So he said, no, I've got to do the rematch, and we're going to do it. So the WBC ended up stripping Spinks, and Top Rank sued him. And then King said, you see that? They're your friends. They're suing you. They took you to court. They're the ones. I'm the one who's with you. Well, of course, he was the beneficiary. And again, according to the rules, he was right. Now, that happened today, and Sulaiman knew that it was Muhammad Ali going through a historical third world title. He would have said to Aram,
he would have figured it out.
That's it. We'll make Norton the interim champ. They'll give you a step-aside fee, but I'm not going to deprive Muhammad Ali the chance of winning a title for the third time and drawing 70,000 people in the Superdome.
Yeah.
So that drew him closer. Then there was a lawsuit with Teddy Brenner, and again, King on the other side, although King was right in that case. But, he would do things. And then Sulaiman would have something like, well, Carlos de Leon, he needs to defend his title. The mandatory contender is somebody from Anaklet Wamba from Nigeria, or no, from Zaire. Nobody wanted to promote the fight. And King would say, all right, I'll put it on for you, I got a mandatory contender. The bantamweight champ is from the Congo, or he's from Tunisia. He's the mandatory. When we owe it to him, can you put that fight? I'll put it on. So he would do these favors.
He would carry favor by...
That's correct. That's correct.
I got you. All right. Well, right now the WBC is in an interesting situation right now with Turki Al-Sheikh.
Oh, yeah, that's unique. Well, yeah, for everybody.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on what's going on with that, with the WBC, Turki Al-Sheikh, how he's kind of coming in and taking over boxing, well, trying to take over boxing. Well, what's your thoughts on all that?
Well, I noticed you had the notes down about Harold Smith, who ran that Wells Fargo scam, and he came.
I was going to lead into that, but okay.
So he came in with millions and was going to take. He got it illegally. Right?
All right. So you beat me to it. We'll talk about. I just for the people listening. The person he's mentioning name is Harold Rossfield Smith. Mm-hmm. Tell us who he was.
Well, he was a guy that popped up, again, literally out of nowhere. They had a company called MAPS, Muhammad Ali Professional Sports, who used Ali's name. I guess he paid him a fee to use his name. Mm-hmm. But little known to most people, he had got involved with a Wells Fargo bank in California with a loan officer, and they embezzled money to invest in boxing. And they were paying disproportionate amounts of money, crazy money. His downfall was when he came to New York, he was going to run a spectacular card in Madison Square Garden. And King and Aram, of course, this was a rival. They had to get rid of this guy, and they knew something was up. There's only 100 cents in every dollar. Yeah. Now, to establish yourself, as I said, when King started, he might pay 120 cents or 150 to say, I'll pay more, like the AFL football paid more for the Jets when they signed Joe Namath. We'll pay above market value, but not 100 times above market value.
Yeah, I got you.
So
he was paying people big money.
Yes, big money, and of course the regular scavengers to say, I'll got to grab it. Others stayed loyal to promoters, but some of them went after it. And he had, I think it was Saad Muhammad, Eddie Mustafa, and Ali, Cooney and Norton going to fight in the Garden. A big spectacular show. And finally, when they started investigating it, they found out that he had embezzled, and they called off the card. Cooney and Norton morphed into its own match, but the other fights fell through. So he came in out of nowhere, and I made a remark to a friend of mine, Norman Henry, was close to him. I said, what did he do, rob a bank? The eyes went up in the head. But we knew there was something. But the point, I'm not saying he's analogous to Turki Al-Sheikh, but every now and then you do have somebody come into boxing that's going to reinvent the wheel, reinvent the glove, reinvent the boxing ring. It's not square, it should be round, whatever. And they come in with an influx of tremendous money. And the Turki Al-Sheikh thing is kind of similar. This is obviously legitimate money that he just wants to spend on boxing. And what I've said is, you need the money, the will, and the direction. So far, he had the money and the will. I don't know, the direction was a little strange. But as you say, now it looks like Dana White has gotten in his ear and say, why are you spending all this money on these promoters? You can be your own promoter. You'll get the fighters. You'll develop them instead of giving millions. But again, you have to get the attention of the world. So he spent whatever, $100 million or $200 million, putting on Tyson Fury and Usyk, and now putting on Canelo and Bivol. So these fights took place. Everybody knows who he is, and now I guess he can step in and sign fighters based on wanting to sign them.
What are your thoughts? So I don't know if you heard the specifics. He wants to build a league. So what he wants to do is create his own title. He wants to be signed. I believe. he wants to eliminate certain weight classes. So he's going to just have his own way of doing things. He's going to have his weight classes, his champions, and all under one roof. What are your thoughts on a promoter not using a sanctioning body and just having his own champion?
Well, we had that for many years, and it's interesting. He bought the Ring magazine, and people said, why is he spending millions for a bankrupt publication from Oscar de la Hoya? And obviously, because years ago, and I suspect that guys like Dana White and Teddy Atlas have been in his ear saying, look, they never had sanctions fees before. The Ring said who was the champ. They had a panel of experts. Well, that worked, but it was flawed because what happened with the Ring, and I knew those people well. Dan Daniel was an idol of mine. He was living into his 80s and was still working at the Ring. Well, didn't have to. He was a great sports writer. And he was a partner with Nat Fleischer when they started in 1922. But they grew old with the publication. You had people at the Ring in the 1960s and 70s like Sam Taub, Fleischer, Daniel, who were in their 80s, and they were thinking of 1922, but it changed. You know, after World War II, as I was saying earlier, the nucleus of boxing was the English-speaking world, the British Commonwealth at the time, United States, and the occasional Cuba, Argentina. We talked about Dominican fighters we were mentioning that didn't exist, but the world changed. Japan, it started becoming an international business, and they didn't grow with that transition. So the Ring, and they tried to do a tournament with King, and it was so flawed that one of the guys who worked for the Ring was setting up the ratings, and he was getting kickbacks and things like that. So they did. Tradition was tradition. When you have a few small countries controlling boxing, you could have one champ following another. But even then, people don't realize you had a split between New York State and the National Boxing Association. You didn't have the same thing. You don't have the activity you had overseas. If you look at the world ratings today, whatever organization you want, Ring Magazine included, you're going to see 85% of the fights are not American any longer. So it's not longer a centralized business. It's not as homogeneous as it was in those days. So, all right, so he's going to go back to traditionally having the champs. So, as I brought up to you before, here's what happened before when the Ring's theory was championships are won and lost in the ring. You have to beat the champ to be the champ. That's fine. So what do you say to Sonny Liston, who was fighting every top contender from 1957 to 1960, and Floyd Patterson is fighting Pete Rademacher, who never had a pro fight, is fighting Tom McNeely, who never beat a contender, is fighting Roy Harris while Liston's beating everyone, and you say, there's no mechanism to get you the title. But if we had a mandatory defense you have to do once a year, then Liston would have been the world champ in 1958. And Jose Napoles would have had a shot at the world championship in 1963, 5 years before he got it. And guys like Jose Legra and Charlie Burley, who never got a title fight, would have been fighting for the championship. It's not a coronation. You win a title, but it's an obligation to the other fighters. So you need some mechanism to enforce rules on the champion.
And so you're in favor of sanctioning bodies because of that?
I think we've morphed that word. That's a word that came out, in the last. They were really, the original intent was an organization of international boxing commissions. That's what they were. The NBA starts in 1920 as the National Boxing Association. But as boxing changed into the 60s, we now have boxing everywhere in the world. But the problem with the NBA was they had their affiliation by commission. Now, in Ohio, every city had a commission. So let's say the National Boxing Association, 1960, had three votes from Ohio alone. Miami had a vote. Miami Beach had a separate vote. So each state, well, in 1920, there might have been 50 shows in Iowa, might have been 30 shows in Georgia. By the 1960s, there were 6 shows. There were 3 shows. Boxing had changed in America, but there were 100 cards in Mexico. So when they made it the WBA, they had the same attitude. Well, Mexico has a national commission. They have 1 vote. But the commission in Arkansas had 1 vote. And the commission in Montana had 1 vote, but the commission in England had 1 vote. Well, why is that? Because we have a national commission, and the U.S. has it by states or counties or even some cases cities.
They were overwhelmed,
it
votes.
Was disproportionate.
Yeah.
So the WBC came along and said, wait a minute, that's not fair. We should either do it based on the amount of fights you have in that district. So if you have 1 vote for every commission, but for every 10 shows in that area, you get an extra vote, or every 50. So then Mexico would have had 10 votes, and Arkansas 1. So they said, we'll do it by continental federation. So NABF has 2. Europe has 2. They gave England 2 separately because they were a foundation, and they were pretty much separate from Europe. And they were having more shows than the rest of Europe. South America has 2. The Orient has 2. Africa has 2. So that was more like the U.S. Senate, so we had 12 votes, and then they had an executive board with 5. That's more fair. But then that sort of became a bit disproportionate. So at least they were saying, we're an international organization. You can't just have it with one country dominant. You may have the U.S. has the most, the plurality, but it no longer is the majority. So that's what the flaw in the WBA was. And then out of the WBA, then the IBF, they ran, and the Americans didn't want. Americans are always going against international organizations. So the perception of some presidents that we might have, that we want to be alone, and then you had the WBO. But I'll tell you, yes, it's very confusing for the fans. It's a great idea to have one champion, as long as you enforce the rules. You know, there's a saying, the law in its infinite wisdom prohibits princes and paupers from sleeping under bridges. If you're going to have one rule for the obscure mini flyweight from the Dominican Republic, you got to have the same rule for Canelo. You can't say, yes, Canelo generates $25 million, so we'll let him have a pass on fighting the mandatory. The rules have to be enforced. The EBU, for years, was always a great organization. They felt that the championship was bigger than the champ. So many times they'd have a very popular champion who would give up the title, saying, well, look, I'm Henry Cooper. I can draw 30,000 people. For whatever reason, you've got a contender from Croatia. If I fought him, nobody wants to see it. I know on merit he deserves it, but I'll relinquish the European title to give it to him. So he gets the champ and continuation. Yeah.
Are you so? How do you feel about 4 belts, for the 4-belt era? Like, if it was up to you, how many sanctioning bodies would there be? Well, it kind of sounds like you're in favor of the sanctioning bodies.
I'm in favor. They should look. You should be able to do it with one. Look. So if you look at why we have 4 sanctioned bodies, and there's many minor ones. Okay, the WBA had the NBA when they morphed into the WBA. Initially had the right idea, but they didn't give up their isolation with the U.S. having too much dominance. And what happened in the 70s, they wised up. So a fellow named Mandy Galindez ran for president, and you had to affiliate the commissions.
The president of
he was a Venezuelan.
Of the WBA?
Yeah, he ran against the president. It was all controlled by like Bill Brennan and Emil Bruno. One was from Virginia, the Bruno was from New Orleans. These guys have been around for 50 years, legitimate people. But it was disproportionately U.S. And in the 70s, we had an explosion of international Mexican boxers, Dominican boxers, British. But now you've got all Russians and Ukrainians, which is great, but it shows the international nature of the business. So they said, you know what? We had an election, ironically, the 200th anniversary of the U.S. If Arkansas has a vote, and Montana has a vote, and Iowa has a vote, and New Jersey has a vote, fine. Mexico has 15, 17 districts. Well, each one of those have a commission. So now we're going to register each district. This district of, Nuevo Leon and the Distrito Federal, and they're only going to have So we have now, instead of 1 vote for Mexico, we have 16. Argentina has 14 states. Now we'll have 14 votes, okay? Now we got 30
votes. They just took over
They took over. They said, wow. And I said to the guys I said, you ran out of real estate.
That's gangster.
Honestly,
that's... So the Latinos came and just united and took it away from America, essentially.
They wised up, and it's been Latino ever since. But I said, so it should be proportionate. Okay, so the WBA, then there was a dispute between the WBA and a fellow named Pepe Cordero, had a lot of influence with them. And he wasn't getting the fires he wanted, so he split. And the IBS split because they ran against Mendoza, who was the president. This is 84. I remember about this. Yeah. And they had to form it. They were the USBA. They were the U.S. arm of the WBA. But again, they saw that America was losing its influence. Well, that's just a fact of life. So what? If the world changes, you got to change with it. Of course, they didn't want that. They lose power. So they elected Bobby Lee, the head of the IBF, which I think a bylaw is that the president must be an American. Well, you can't have an international organization that says only one country. You can't have it must only be an Icelandic, a Russian, a Dominican, a Guatemala. No, whoever gets elected can be. It's a world organization. So they pulled away, and then you had the WBO. So they pulled away. But what happened, again, it's probably a byproduct of what I said, with the promotional rights, you were not able to make great fights, just 10-round fights. Like Jerry Quarry fought in the Garden here. He fought Mac Foster. He boxed against... Ron Lyle, and he boxed Shavers. 3 fights, 18,000 people. None of those fights were a world title fight. Just solid fights between top contenders. And it's almost impossible to make those kind of fights now. So what do you do alternatively? Get a world title fight. And the value of the world title changes. The guy can be a $10,000 fighter, and he's a $100,000 fighter if he wins the world title. Amazingly, the case. And I guarantee you these organizations are flooded with promoters calling them, I need a title fight. I need a title fight. And
so having more than one is beneficial for the fighters financially.
It's probably beneficial. It had hurt because a fighter used to be able to make a living without a championship. A lot of times fighters made more money who weren't champions than the champion. A guy could he had the title, but a guy could be a great attraction without it. Jerry Quarry would be making millions today as a contender because you could draw, but you can't make those kind of fights. That's what's changed.
I got you. Is that the biggest change in boxing? Or what would you say is the biggest change in boxing?
Decentralization. Again, when I talked to you about when I started boxing 50 years ago, that had more in common with boxing 50 years before then, 1909, than it has in boxing in 2025. Every major city ran boxing on a regular basis. So when we talk about major leagues in other sports, we're talking about the major cities. New York has a hockey team, a basketball team, football. LA has the same. Chicago has the same. Philadelphia, every big city has a major sport, right? The top four. Yeah. And the lesser cities have maybe one of them. Every city, what they had more of than any of those were boxing. Philadelphia was running, and my day, when I was young, I guess that means when you come into puberty, my day, right? So Philly was running big fights every month. New York, the Garden had big fights every month. LA had big fights every month. Big fights. There was no Las Vegas. That was an afterthought. Las Vegas did a lot to kill. RFB, called Room Food and Beverage Promotes, did a lot to kill boxing. So what happened? They stopped running shows. And I've asked to this day, which drives me crazy, why? I wish you got the president of Madison Square Garden and the Barclays Center here. Ask, why don't you run boxing? They'll say, we have boxing. No. It used to be where Madison Square Garden had their own promoter. They ran the shows. They promoted the fighters without contracts.
Yeah,
they had the TV rights. Yeah.
And with Madison Square Garden, it's such a shame, right? So it's the mecca of boxing. Boxing rarely happens in the big room. Like anytime, anytime it's like, oh yeah, you saw the fight at the Garden. We're referring to the Hulu Theater.
Right.
We're referring to the 5,000 small room in Madison Square Garden. That's what we're referring to. And it's unfortunate. I mean, I know Katie Taylor and Amanda Serrano sold it out. But before that, I guess it was Anthony Joshua, Andy Ruiz. That was
the last time.
But it's few and far in between, and it doesn't give off mecca of boxing kind of vibes.
Because you don't have the continuity. I'll give you an example of how things were. And were they better? Yes, they were existentially better. It's not an opinion. There was a fighter, I would mention Frank DePaula. He was from Jersey City, an Italian, a very popular guy, not the greatest fighter in the world. So there's a fight, Bob Foster fought for the title. It's another guy, 10 years out there in the wilderness before he got his shot. He boxed Dick Tiger. The semifinal was Angel Oquendo and Johnny Pearsall. And we had a walkout bout. So they had TV that was then, you would sell the television. You wouldn't have a network. You would you would sell by different venues, different locations.
Yeah.
Okay? And so the walkout bout was Frank DePaula and a guy, Freddie Williamson. They had fought twice before. Once in Jersey City, DePaula won. Once in Sunnyside Garden, New York, where Williamson was a New York kid. He won. Black and white fighters, and they were always they were tough club fights. It's syndication. You'd syndicate the show. And so the walkout, Foster knocks out Tiger in the fourth round, but they were booked for, 10 rounds, 40 minutes. They needed something. So they put DePaula in the walkout bout. He sold a lot of tickets. First round, DePaula goes down. Everybody gets up. They're ready to leave. Wait a minute, gets up. He knocks down Freddie Williams. Oh, everybody sits down. Second round, Williams comes out, batters DePaula around the ring. Everybody gets up to leave. The next round, DePaula batters him around the ring. Everybody sits down. He's up, he's down. One of those kind of fights. DePaula knocks him out in the sixth round. Again, like I said earlier about Duran and Buchanan, everybody leaves that arena not talking about Foster, talking about this Frank DePaula. On the strength of that, they bring him back in July to fight a guy, Rocky Rivero, in a semifinal bout to Ismael Laguna.
And this is all in the Madison Square
This
Garden.
is all in the Garden. May of '68, now July of '68. Rugged fight. Rivero was a blown-up middleweight, but he was a puncher, and same kind of fight. DePaul's getting knocked around, he throws one punch, knocks him out. Off of that fight, they bring him to, they just opened the Hulu, which was called the Felt Forum. It was September of '68, and he fights a guy, Jimmy McDermott, from Springfield, Mass. They sold out the Felt Forum, $5 ring size. I remember Teddy Brennan said $27,000 gross in the Felt Forum. Unbelievable. And before the fight, they say, ladies and gentlemen, he will meet the winner of tonight's bout, Dick Tiger. Get your tickets. He'll fight the winner. Same kind of fight. DePaul's losing, throws a shot, knocks the guy out. They had the tickets on sale printed when you left the arena. They put him in Tiger in October 1968. The fight drew 10,000 people, 10-round fight. It was the Ring Magazine Fight of the Year, 4 knockdowns. DePaul loses. Now, they couldn't do Tiger because he got destroyed by Foster, so they made an excuse. He went to Africa. And Brenner, who was a purist, didn't want to make the match. And the owner, Irving Mitchell Felt, they named the Felt Forum after him, not because it was Felt Seats, because his name was Felt. And he said, I'm reading in the paper, Teddy, that they're going to make in the Jersey City Armory Bob Foster against Frank DePaula. What's with that? He said, well, I don't want to make the match a mismatch. He said, well, tell me about it. He said, it'll draw 18,000 people and go 1 round. So Felt says to him, Teddy, he says, we're in the business of making money, make the fight. He made the match. The fight was in January of 1969. Foster knocked out DePaul in 1 round. He was down and knocked DePaul down 3,000, and he drew 18,000 people. But from a 6-round walkout bout, DePaul, in May of '68, they went to a 10-round semifinal that drew 8,000, a 10-round a sellout at the Felt Forum that drew 5,000, 10,000 people in October, and 18,000 people. 7 months, they took a guy from a 6-rounder to the world title and drew 18,000. That's what you can do with the continuity. This guy's coming back because fans are the best matchmaker. I want to see this one with that one.
So you go to a fight in Madison Square Garden. Wow, that guy was great. And it's like, well, he's actually fighting in 2 months.
Right, 2 months. He's fighting in Las Vegas. Yeah. Duran and Huertas. He came back 9 months later, and he fought Buchanan in the Garden, not in Las Vegas. I'll give you the perfect example of the flawed theory. They did shows. PBC did shows they did a show in Brooklyn.
Yeah, in Barclays.
Right.
Which they were doing consistently.
Yes. Yeah. But they had to fight Paulie Malignaggi against Zab Judah.
I was at that fight.
Great crowd. Not a title fight.
Yeah.
He wins Malignaggi. Now, in my time, again, Kevin Porter, I think, was the champ. Right?
Sean Porter.
Sean Porter.
Yeah.
They would have said the winner, because we know the winner's going to fight, will fight for the title. This fight, whatever the date was, 90 days from now. It's in June, October, we're going to have the winner fight. And they would announce it. Here he is, Sean Porter, fighting the winner October 1st at Barclays. The winner fought Porter in Washington, D.C. Why? If they own the fighters, if Barkley was the promoter, of course, because all we care about in Barclays is selling out the building.
Well, what do you make of, like, all right, boxers back then when they retire, they were a lot less healthy than the boxers now when they retire. And there's that, oh yeah, you're fighting in 90 days. We don't get that now. No. Is there a trade-off? Like, all right, maybe these guys aren't fighting as active, but now when they're 50, 60 years old, you can shake their hand and kind of have a conversation with them and everything be okay. What do you think of that trade-off?
Oh, you're 100% right. I mean, you're the pure. If you're a fan, I want to fight this, that. Yeah, you're not thinking of first of all, when they say that, they're not thinking who's paying for that. You can make any fight in your mind. Like I was a kid writing letters to Teddy Brenner. Yeah. And you're not thinking of, but this kid's going to take a beating and you want to fight 6 weeks later, you want to fight that. Yes, that is a trade-off. I think we're a lot safer than we were. And remember, they're making at the top level, they're making incredibly more money than this. You can have one fight and never fight again. If we're average people or working people, you made one payday of $10 million. I don't care if you're 35. You'd never have to work again. You could manage your money and live. You're not going to live like a king, but you could live the rest of your life. That was almost impossible in those days,
Yeah. Talk to me about the Olympic Auditorium.
Okay.
The Olympic Auditorium, from what I understand, was basically the Madison Square Garden of Los Angeles. Tell me about it. I don't know much.
Well, it worked. It opened in the 1920s, and L.A. was a growing city. It was probably the fastest growing city in America in the 20th century. It went from a little town, and then Hollywood came there, but it just kept getting bigger exponentially. And when New York grew in the late 19th, L.A. was sort of that answer, and especially after the war. And when it began, it's interesting because the early fights were not featuring primarily Mexican fighters. That subculture had not manifested itself to the point where it became really the backbone of boxing in the Olympic. But as that grew, the Olympic was the beneficiary of it. And I mean, everybody fought there, Henry Armstrong and great fighters, but it became really the capital of Mexican-American boxing. And through Art Aragon, Enrique Bolaños, Baby Arizmendi, and up to Mondo Ramos, Raul Rojas, everybody fought in the Olympics. But all the great fighters did as well. Floyd Patterson and Sonny Liston.
Why they closed down? Why is it no longer a thing?
Again, because the boxing changed. Boxers, again, the promotional rights. You can't make any fight that you wanted to make. Again, Las Vegas killed Los Angeles. Atlantic City in the early days killed New York. When you can get those fights subsidized, I brought this up as well. Look, Madison Square Garden should have signed the nucleus of the heavyweight division in an era was Jerry Cooney, Mike Tyson, and Riddick Bowe, three of the greatest heavyweights. They all had something in common. They were all heavyweight. Well, Jerry fought for the title, but they were all heavyweight contenders. They were all the biggest attraction.
And they're all New Yorkers.
They were all New Yorkers. But what's the thing they didn't do? They didn't sign with Madison Square Garden. When Madison Square Garden signed when the Olympians turned pro, Holyfield, Meldrick Taylor, Whitaker, all on one card, all gold medalists, Tyrell Biggs, and they were the cornerstone of American boxing for the next decade. They all fought in Madison Square Garden when they turned pro. What was wrong? Madison Square Garden didn't sign any one of those fighters. Why not? Go to the Olympic. Jerry Buss was a very wealthy man. He owned the Forum, which was the competition to the Olympic. The two great Mexican-American and Mexican fighters of that generation were Julio Cesar Chavez and Oscar De La Hoya. Nobody was bigger. How is it Jerry Buss didn't sign Chavez and De La Hoya to be exclusively with the Olympic or with the Forum? What happened there? Something happened. People stopped going to the fights again because you couldn't make fights. When television came in, what they have in the NFL is a rule, or they used to have it. We will black out the area. I remember as a kid, people driving to Connecticut, see the Giants play.
Yeah.
Until you sell out. You sell out the game, we'll lift the blackout. But it's a 90-mile blackout. When CBS and ABC and NBC came back, they didn't say, if you have a fight in the Garden, it's going to be blacked out. But if you can watch a fight that you're paying $200 ringside at the corner bar, it's in the Garden, people got used. 99% of the fans have never been to a fight today. They only know it through television.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that. So I mentioned to you before, I'm known as the voice of Dominican boxing, and we're known for Dominicans are known for not selling tickets. Right. I have a friend of mine, Juan De Lo Mio, who he was a boxing fan his whole life, and it wasn't until I encouraged him to buy a ticket to go to a fight and support Dominicans. Right. He went to a fight. He brought his daughter. He brought his family. And he was like, I never been to a fight, man. This is awesome. Thank you so much for convincing me this, that, and the third. So hearing you say that just brought that to mind. I wish fans would be more motivated to support the sport. Just one, for the health of it. And two, you get a different feel when you at a fight, when you know. And you get to meet a lot of people too.
You big part of it. That's how I did by osmosis. You get it, and it's easy to transition, and you become and in boxing, you get closer to the participants than any other sport.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. You go to a fight, you may meet Mike Tyson, you may meet Shannon Briggs, you may meet Duran. This is very realistic possibilities when you go to a fight, especially the bigger the fight, the bigger the chances of you running into one of these stars. Yeah. But yeah, no, I totally agree with you.
And it's the consistency you brought up. Look, if we had fights every month, good fights at the Garden, you'd create fans. You may start out with 5,000 the first show and then 6,000 because they say, hey, so-and-so is fight. You get to know the fighters. You see, you know the preliminary fights.
Be like, oh, that's the guy that I saw a couple months ago. Yeah.
Yes. And the unique thing about boxing than anything else, because of the parochial nature of it, you see a fighter, you root for a local guy. It's not because he has New York Yankees, New York Knicks. That guy lives in Brooklyn. That guy lives in Westchester. That guy lives in Yonkers. You might see him at the supermarket. He's not a ball player, comes here and plays 6 months a year and goes home to California or Florida. They're actually from the area. So you can build a local following that would, every time they fight, that local following grows. The ones who know him personally go out. Then people read about him in the paper. They say, he's a contender. Now he's a champ. You can see that exponentially grow as the fight develops. So consistently running shows, bringing back the winners in fights. It's a very simple process. You just need, like at Turk Ali Sheikh, the money, the will, and the direction to do it.
Man, I hope this conversation goes somewhere. Somebody sees this, gets motivated, it gets to the right people, because I definitely feel like these are good ideas, especially you, someone who's seen it happen firsthand. I wanted to ask you about Jack Dempsey.
Okay.
Jack Dempsey, how big was he back in his time?
Well, I can only say that in my time he was huge. They had a night for him at Madison. He was like somebody would say it was seeing Jack Dempsey in a restaurant is like seeing the Statue of Liberty sit down to dinner.
So this guy was.
He was the man. In 1970, they had a birthday party. It was his 80th birthday, and they brought in Carpentier from France and Jack Sharkey.
Wow.
And guys that he had for Gene Tunney was there, and the fact they drew, well, it was Foster and Quarry, but added to that Dempsey, 18,000 people. His restaurant was a shrine. I used to be like a runner for a booking agent, Dewey Forgetter, and part of the job when a foreign fighter came in here is, look, you take him over to Rubens for a sandwich. You take him down to the Empire State Building, and then you take him to Dempsey's. It's like run around and, okay, we do this. And Dempsey would come out and I'd have, say, Carlos Monzon. Okay, who's this? Is it Monzon? Where is he from? Argentina. I fought Luis the Firpo. It was the fight of the century. And a smile, take a picture. And the manager was glowing more than Monzon. Another guy comes back. Who's this guy? Oh, it's Jean-Claude Boutier. Where's France? France, I fought George Carpentier. And then they'd see, you again. Where's this guy from? He's from Montana. Montana, Tommy Gibbons, fantastic. But he was sincere. And
so he was a really friendly guy.
Friendly guy, accessible person. The guy probably up to Muhammad, I saw him more autographs than anybody. You read the famous story, was it by, about the face in the window. Gay Talese, Pulitzer Prize-winning story. And it was just, remarkable. But in the 20s, just forget it. He was making more money. He made more money for the Firpo fight. I think it was $550,000. Than entire baseball franchise payroll. So the entire Brooklyn Dodgers, 25 players, made less money cumulatively than Jack Dempsey made for one fight.
Wow.
So put that in perspective. What do we have with the guy making who signed with the Mets? He's making $45 million a year.
He signed 15 years, $765 million, whatever the math that makes.
Now he's got 24 other players. Add that up, that'd be like $180 million a year. Well, Dempsey made as much as a whole team.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. I got a little controversial question regarding Firpo. Dempsey.
Yeah.
There's controversy that when Firpo dropped him, he fell out of the ring.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't going to be able to make it out the ring, and he was pushed back in.
Yes, it's probably the case. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you. Because the camera kind of cuts off at that moment. You can't really see.
Yeah.
But that's what was said. Do you think that's what happened?
It may have happened. Everything again about Dempsey, how big he was. He's become such. Everything he did was legendary. When he gets knocked out of the ring, it's controversial. Should he and would he? That's the long count when he loses the rematch with Tunney. That's legendary. He beats Sharkey in between, and they say Sharkey turned to the ref to complain about a low blow, and Dempsey hits him in the face. He wins the title in a legendary fashion. He loses the title in a legendary fashion. Mm-hmm. So even the controversies are legendary, And the fact we're talking about it's 100 years later, we're discussing this today, 100 years after. For now, he probably did. But if it was today, I think he had knocked down Firpo 7 times up to that point. So it may have got to the point where he was knocked out of the ring.
Yeah. How big of a star was Sugar Ray Robinson in his day?
Robinson, again, we go back now, his heyday was like 70 years ago in the 50s. He even fought fought long before. We talk about fighters fighting too long. He's one who probably fought longer than anybody else. A great fighter should have. Yeah, he is the fighter who by which all other fighters before or since are measured. Like he is the paragon. everybody is measured against Robinson. I've rarely seen unanimity in boxing, because if you ask 10 people who's the best heavyweight, some would say Joe Louis, many would say Muhammad Ali, some say Tyson. People come out with, may pick Mayweather, but almost to a person, Sugar Ray Robinson is considered to be the greatest fighter of all time. There's going to be dissent, but he's at the 99% level, where, as you know, nobody agrees on anything in this.
Do you have a top 5 all time? Can I nail you down for 5 fighters? It looks like Robinson is number 1 for you.
Yeah, Robinson, definitely. Everything he's done was so remarkable. The early career, again, I rate him as the greatest. He's a great middleweight. You could argue he's the greatest middleweight, but he's also could be argued to be the greatest welterweight of all time. So he's one of the
he's the only fighter to win Fighter of the Decade in 2 different decades. So he's definitely a legend.
Absolutely remarkable. Again, he's a guy that if you had an organization around, he would have been the number 1 contender in the lightweight division in the early 1940s. So he would have been, under today's circumstances, he'd have been a lightweight, junior welterweight, junior middleweight, super middleweight, light heavyweight champ. And remember, you take the path of least resistance. Roy Jones can claim to be a heavyweight champ of the world.
Yes.
But he never beat Klitschko, the best title.
Or Lennox Lewis.
That's right. Yeah. He knew how to go, well, the WBA middleweight champ is not as tough as the WBC. We'll go that route. Yeah, Robinson had to fight the best of the best.
That's an argument Jose Corpus, our mutual friend, makes all the time. He's like, this guy was, 10 division world champion. And it's like, well, this other guy would have done that too, but it was only 1 belt and there was only so many divisions. So it's like, of course he can't have that accomplishment. So I definitely I see that. But you're not gonna skirt up.
Pound for pound?
Yeah, top 5 pound for pound all time. Number 1, Robinson.
Yeah, well, Robinson, I would say, if I include heavyweights, then I would
including heavyweights.
All right, so then Robinson, Ali, Joe Louis, Jack Johnson, and Sam Langford. That's the old guys. And then the next niche I would go with, if I break them down, like the Hall of Fame has moderns and old times. So if I go to the modern, then I would go Robinson, Ali, Joe Louis, Henry Armstrong, and probably Duran.
Okay, wow, Duran, okay.
And then on the old timers, I would go Jack Johnson, Sam Langford, Harry Greb, Benny Leonard, and Dempsey or Joe Gans.
Interesting. Yeah. That's an interesting top 5. Sugar Ray Leonard couldn't squeeze in. You got Duran over Leonard?
Well, with Duran, it's a very hard one, because that first fight, everybody says Duran's great. That fight could have gone either way.
It could have gone either way. It was a split decision, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so
and one judge, I think, had 12 rounds even, some insane score. I think he had like 2-1 and 12. Well, come on, what is that?
Yeah. That was crazy.
But Duran, again, because he was...
I was okay with the decision.
Yeah.
It could have gone either way, but I was okay. But go ahead, you were saying?
It's some people analyze Duran with me, and they say, maybe he was not as... He was the greatest lightweight, you could argue, and even then, I think Benny Leonard accomplished more as champion, as a lightweight, better opposition than Duran. Mm-hmm. I think because the career went so long, he boxed for 30 years.
I got you.
So that's sort of like the Archie Moore factor kicks in. I think Ezra Charles is the better fighter than Moore, but Moore had a longer career than him. Yeah. And after he was lightweight, after the Leonard victory, he really didn't do much. He gets disproportionate amount of praise for what he knocked out a guy, Davey Moore, to win the junior middleweight title. Now I'm arguing against my own case with Duran.
That's why I'm like, that's why I kind of pushed back on you.
So maybe I go with Pep and Charles above him. But, that was a guy, I remember sitting there, was a guguy, Baha Muhammad was a matchmaker. We were sitting there and pointing out, they put on the screen in the garden, Duran, I think he was 61-3 or something, and Davey went 9-0. I said, this is a 6-round fighter. 50 years ago, this would have been a 6-round fighter with a 10-round fight. Yeah. He's supposed to knock out a 9-0 guy. And even then, he wasn't the best fighter at the way Tommy Hearns was, who knocked Duran out.
Knocked him out in 2 rounds.
Yeah, 2 rounds, 2 fights later at the Hagler match. So he gets a tremendous amount of accolade from winning those fights. But what did he really do? Even the Barkley fight could have gone either way. That was a split decision.
Yeah.
So he, out of those fights, he really didn't dominate outside the lightweight, but I think he was so overwhelming a lightweight and defended it, was undefeated, lost only to De Jesus,
who he knocked out
twice subsequently. Yeah. So that probably disproportionately affects somebody's assessment, and the fact that he had fought for 30 years, and
I got you. Yeah. I got you. Longevity. I can respect that. that Four Kings era where it was Duran, Hagler, Hearns, Leonard. That era, I'm too young to have lived it, unfortunately, but that was amazing how they all fought each other. None of the fights were too late, you know. As you know, they all fought each other in their primes, and it's the fact that you got him over everybody, I found surprising.
I probably, if you want to ask who accomplished the most, it was probably Tommy Hearns, because he actually went up. Remember, he
went up to light heavyweight.
Yes, light heavyweight. He knocked out a Hall of Famer in Pino Cuevas to win that title.
So did Duran. Duran knocked Cuevas out too, right?
Yes, he did. Afterwards, when he made the comeback. So those the great fights that he beat Cuevas. He came back and he did win the title with Davey Moore, and So Spectacular sold out the Garden after the ignominious loss to Leonard, but people all seem to gloss over, But so Tommy, and then he came back, he knocked out Roldan. He fought a draw with Ray Leonard that most people thought that he won, and Tommy Hearns I'm speaking of.
Yeah, no, I know.
Yeah, and then he came back and he beat Virgil Hill, which is a fight he doesn't get much credit for. And Virgil Hill was a Hall of Famer,
and a silver medalist in the
yeah. So he did a lot. The continuity, he probably lasted longer than the other guys. Ray fought the best at his best and never. He was sort of like a Mayweather. He fought you at his optimum. He fought Benitez, but he fought him once. He was always on the conditions that Ray Leonard wanted.
I mean, but he stopped Benitez. So
he did.
I didn't see a necessary.
No, right. No, I'm saying, but he was always there. Well, but it went 15 rounds, and all right.
And the stoppage was, he could have finished that right.
And I'll tell you, Benitez, talk about the great four fighters, the Four Kings, but he was just on the rim he was on the periphery of that, and they all fought him as well.
He beat Duran.
That's right. That's another fight we forget about. So thinking about I might go Pep and Charles on a tie there. At his best, Leonard was the best of the fighters. I mean, at his peak, he beat all of them.
The only one to have beat all of them.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So he didn't hold any one title as long as Duran did to dominate, I guess. That's maybe the one thing, right?
I understand.
He was the greatest welterweight, but then he moved out of that. And he was the middleweight champ, but he didn't dominate. But Duran, again, he really only dominated the one championship, the lightweight.
The lightweight. Yeah. Okay. You brought up Mayweather. He was on my list that I wanted to get to you. I'm someone who is a big advocate of Mayweather. I get a lot of pushback from the old school guys.
Yep.
I think that his 50-0 should be respected. I understand that undefeated isn't everything. Believe me. I understand one loss doesn't mean that you're a terrible fighter. Yeah. But I also don't think it means nothing.
No, absolutely.
Especially when you look at his resume, he has Pacquiao and Cotto and Mosley and all these guys on his resume. Yeah. So it's not, maybe it's De La Hoya. He has a very good resume, and he was clearly the best of his era. I'll say that. And I feel like he has an argument to be in definitely top 5, if not the best ever. Tell me why I'm wrong.
You mean Mayweather?
Mayweather, yes. Tell me why my opinion is.
No, if we had this conversation in 2099, and we had a time machine, you froze me cryogenically, and you said, who's the best fighter of the 21st century? I would say Floyd Mayweather. So I think coming 75 years from now, I think he will still be the best fighter of the 21st century. There's no doubt. Absolutely great. He beat 8 Hall of Famers, whether he fought them 10 times. The thing you would argue with Ray Robinson, well, he did the same thing as Mayweather, only beat those guys 2 times, 3 times, 4 times. So the activity level has changed. That's what we talked about Duran.
Yeah, and that has to more do with the era more so than anything.
Yeah, baseball players will not win 370 games like Christy Mathewson did because they're not playing 40 times a year. They're not winning 30 games in a year. So, but if you ask, did he fight everybody? Did he beat everybody? I think it was for the 50th. Let's give him a push on. But, he just wanted to break that record. But the legitimate 49-0, 100%, absolutely the best. My reason for not ranking him among that other group, again, it's just activity, where we brought up about Duran. If you go as a fighter at his best, I think he's the equivalent of everyone. As a welterweight, I would only rate Robinson, Armstrong, Leonard ahead of him. I mean, I think he's better than Jack Britton's, the Ted Kid Lewis's, Mike, all those old times. Napoles, who's my idol, Gavilan, who was a great fighter. I rate Mayweather's a better fighter than that.
Yeah, what do you make of his defense? CompuBox wasn't around all the way back then, but if we go by CompuBox, he has the highest percentage of landed punches with the lowest percentage of punches landed on him.
Yeah.
So, like, if we look at the analytics, the statistics, it shows he's number one. What do you make of his defensive style? And is there any defensive fighter from the past that you can say maybe was as good, if not better?
Well, Whitaker was a great defensive fighter.
Great defensive fighter.
Terrific fighter. And going back many years ago, I'm sure there were, guys like Jack Britton and these guys who would never get knocked out, Gene Tunney and Rosenblum. But, when people argue against Mayweather, the point one can bring up is say, well, what is it that he didn't do right? What is it you don't like about it? Well, he didn't fight 150 fights. That's something else. Yeah. Well, Robinson would have had a jab. You don't know that. What he's done, on accomplishment, what didn't he do? What did he not do that makes you say he was not as good as this one or that one? And he's done everything asked of him. Yeah, a great defensive fighter, and he had some offensive. Well, you don't win fights just on defense. So obviously he was throwing punches as well. And a dominating guy. I mean, when he fought Ricky
Hatton.
That was the only fight I ever bet on. I went down and bet $500. I said, this is an impossibility for him. He can't lose to this guy. Absolutely perfect style. And he knocked him out. He stopped him. That's a Hall of Famer. Just blew through him. No, and he fought Canelo and he fought Oscar. And, I mean, some people said those were close fights, this and that. Regardless, he fought and he beat every single one of them. Never turned down anyone. No, absolutely. Terrific. Sensational fighter.
All right. And this will be my last question. Well, no, actually, it won't. I want to know. I want to know about the ascension of Mike Tyson.
Oh, okay.
So, right, you got into boxing in the '60s, and you seen, Ali and Duran and all these guys, and Mike Tyson is coming up, 20 years old, knocking grown men out cold in one round. This is something boxing has never seen before and has not seen since. Tell me about living in that moment right there.
Yeah.
Seeing Mike Tyson's development.
Well, my friend Johnny Boz was actually his matchmaker. He worked for Caton and Jim Jacobs and, put a lot of his early fights together. And they were talking about him. And he was a teenager. It was a phenomenon. Even, Floyd Patterson started out very young. He turned pro, won the Olympics at 17. But he didn't have the projection. Mike Tyson was like a teenage Sonny Liston. Or, like Dempsey. If you had seen Dempsey on TV developing, you might have had an idea what Tyson was. Yeah, and he came up so quickly and knocked out Trevor Berbick. He was a great fighter. I'll tell you, the charisma factor, there's nothing you can say about it. Dempsey we talked about with the controversy in his day where he didn't go in the Army, and they said he had patent leather shoes working at a plant welding things. And then Ali, with the black Muslim situation, alienated people. And Tyson, he had the rape allegation, or he was convicted of it, and the biting of the ear. But nothing has stemmed the tide. Mike Tyson, most popular fighter in the world today, regardless of what happened. He just has that charisma factor. And that came about not just his personality, how great a fighter he was in the ring. I firmly believe Tyson was a greater fighter at his peak than Lennox Lewis or Holyfield or Riddick Bowe or the Klitschko's. Absolutely. And you go anywhere now, you ask for a fighter to go sign autographs, the number one choice of anybody will be Mike Tyson. And watching him develop, great. And we thought he was going to be champ forever. But there are factors that contribute. A guy gets full of himself. He lost. He couldn't get the rematch with Buster Douglas. Had he gotten it, he would have knocked out Douglas.
100%.
And just worked against him. He never fought him again. And then he did recapture the title afterwards. But he had peaked. Like Benitez was a phenomenon, 17, 18. By the time he was 24, he was gone. Fighters develop at different stages of their career. So when they say, oh, Tyson, this and that, yes, but he was done at 24. But what a record. And an absolute, like a comet. He was the Halley's Comet of boxing.
Yeah, no, he wins the championship by second round knockout over Trevor Berbick. Then unifies, undisputes the division within a year. And then I think a year later, everybody's saying, well, Michael Spinks is actually the lineal champion for one against Texas. Then goes and ice him and won.
Yes.
It was like I can only imagine after that. What was your exact thought after that knockout of Michael Spinks in one, like, did you think this may be the greatest fighter of all time? What was your thinking?
Well, yeah, to interject quickly, the four kings we talk about, the Hearns and Leonard and Duran and Hagler. Michael Spinks was a great light heavy.
Might be the greatest light heavyweight of all time.
Yeah, and Butch Lewis I was working for him as a match. We tried to make Hagler and Spinks, and Hagler's people turned that down. They didn't want to take the risk. I mean,
he's much bigger.
He's much bigger, but you figure, well, Duran went up and fought, and the Hearns went up and fought. He's the one guy that didn't. Again, he was dominant. He was as dominant middleweight as Hearns was a lightweight, despite the loss to Leonard, who, again, we can argue was the best of the four. But going back to that, yes, Michael Spinks, a great fight. When he won that fight, I mean, the perception was this is invincible. This was like when I saw Foreman knock out Frazier. He'll be champ for 10 years. He shows the experts don't know anything. But, the biggest factor in boxing with fights, and people don't credit this, is psychology. Mm-hmm. Your mind changes. I said Liston was a sharp fighter by the time he got to Patterson because he had achieved everything. Frazier was a sharp fighter by the time he fought Ali. When he beat Ali, that was the end for him. Manley never wanted to fight again, and his career proved it. Mm-hmm. And Tyson, when he beat Spinks and then he follows up with a one-round knockout, I think, of Carl Williams, that was it. He was on a cloud. I don't have to train. I can do anything. And again, the 30-1 odds with Buster Douglas, still the greatest upset of all time in boxing history. Mm-hmm. He goes in. He believes he's 30-1. So the mind wasn't set for a fight. And then when he lost, I think that affected him beyond just the ring. You could see the things that happened to him.
Outside the ring,
yes, just didn't have that strength. But he was absolutely one of the greatest fighters of all time.
I totally agree. All right, well, as you know, I'm the voice of Dominican boxing.
Fantastic.
So now I'm going to ask you about some Dominican boxers.
Okay.
And I want to start off with the first Dominican boxing world champion in Carlos Teo Cruz. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What can you tell me about Carlos Teo Cruz?
He was a working man's hero. And with Carlos Teo Cruz, again, the old school, Louis Rodriguez and Annapolis I mentioned, and Liston I mentioned, and Griffith, Bob Foster, Harold Johnson. He was not a great fighter like that. He was like the working class guy, but he was here in New York, and it was before my time, but I know reading about it. You always heard his name. He was fighting preliminary fights at Sunnyside Garden, and I think even maybe at St. Nicholas Arena. And he was winning some, and he was losing some. And when he fought in the Garden, he fought undercard 6 rounds. He couldn't even get a main event. But he battled his way through and fought his way up. He had a big win over Frankie Narvaez. That sort of catapulted him to fame. Mm-hmm. And he became the number 1 contender. And again, as you know, the largest ethnic group in New York City now are Dominicans.
Yes.
But 50, 60 years ago, nobody knew what a Dominican was, I mean, I'm going to Santo Domingo, they would say. They wouldn't even say the Dominican Republic. Funny thing, I had a friend, Tony Shabibi, who was my best friend growing up, and they were Dominicans, but they were the only Dominicans. The Dominican was a nun when I was growing up, not an ethnicity. Yeah. So he comes up on the slow, hard way, fought his way up there, never really got a break, and he becomes number 1 contender legitimately. And the fight he has to fight is one of the all-time greats and a great Latino and a hero of New York, Carlos Ortiz. He had been Fighter of the Year. He had beaten Sugar Ramos in Mexico and then beat Ismael Laguna in Shea Stadium. There were like 27,000 people. He wins the fight. He's on a crest. Nobody's beating Carlos Ortiz. Least of all, Carlos Teo Cruz, And he goes and he fights him, and he beats him in a 15-round decision. Really shocking to people. And he comes back, and he beats Mondo Ramos, the hottest fighter in California, on a decision. Then he do the rematch, and he gets stopped on the cut eye and loses the title. But he comes back to New York. I saw him fight Victor Melendez here, and he beat him. And he was still, on the cusp, and then had the tragedy where he dies in the plane crash. But he was a guy who earned this. He was a guy like he started out as the mail boy, and he ended up as the chairman of the board. All hard knocks. You talk about an inspiration, a perfect guy for Dominican people because they were really on the lowest social, economic level of all the like Latinos. I mean, the Puerto Ricans, the upper echelon, the Mexicans in California, the Dominicans had to fight for everything. And boy, this guy had the hard way to it. Earned that title, really earned it against a great fighter.
Wow, that's amazing. And you knew his trainer?
Yeah, Peter Martinez was a guy who worked with him, and he was friendly with Bill Daly, who was the manager of Carlos Ortiz.
Okay.
So, we would see them around, and as they say, he worked at getting the title. And you can look at through his career. It didn't come to him. Nobody built him up to 20-0 or 15-0. He wasn't that kind of an attraction.
I got
He
you.
had to fight, and it was, a hard way to the top. I mean, he won, he lost, he had the patience to stick with it, and he did.
Oh, no. That's awesome. Are you familiar with Fausto Ceja
Yes,
Rodriguez?
the welterweight. He was a tough. Now that was a guy who was thought to be. He didn't live up to the potential. Whereas Teo Cruz was a guy. He's a good fighter. He's a solid fighter. That's what Teo Cruz was. He can handle anybody. Fausto was a guy that everybody said this guy's going to be champion. And I don't know. Something happened there. Maybe he got success too quickly. But that was the guy that was going to define the Dominican fighters. Yeah.
Okay. Miguel Montilla.
Well, Montilla was a guy that, now he was a top contender. He came into New York. Here's an interesting story. He got his title fight. Why? He was a byproduct of Gulf and Western. Gulf and Western took over Madison Square Garden. They are a big corporation, $1 trillion corporation. And they had holdings in the Dominican Republic, oil holdings.
Oh, really?
And they wanted to put a championship fight on. Well, they own the Garden, but they wanted to bring in Antonio Cervantes, one of the all-time greats. He only fought once here. And they actually underwrote him coming to Madison Square Garden. Not to fight Roberto Duran, which would have been a mega fight, but to fight Miguel Montilla. So he was, unlike Carlos Teo Cruz, he was the beneficiary of being a Dominican. He got a multinational corporation to sponsor his world title fight because of the fact he was in the Dominican Republic and Gulf and Western was doing big business there.
Wow,
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yes,
Okay.
Charles Bluedhorn, he was the owner of Madison Square Garden at that time. And Don King put on the show, but he put it on at the direction of Charles Bluedhorn. We need a Dominican fight for the world title. And Miguel Montilla was the designated Dominican to fight for that championship.
How good was he?
He was good. Unfortunately, again, he fought an all-time great at the peak of his career, Antonio Cervantes. A fighter I remember also, Juan Guzman was the first fighter I remember of Dominican heritage who was a world champ, but unfortunately was a mini flyweight and didn't get the recognition. But he came after Teo Cruz. But it was lucky because fighters, there were lighter weights, and when they opened up, a lot of people argue about all the divisions, but it opened up those divisions. 115, 112 was there, but you have now 108, 105. And there was a lot of fighters in certain countries that wouldn't have a chance unless they had these championships for them. So it gave a guy like that the opportunity to fight and win a title.
Okay. All right. Last Dominican fighter I'll ask about. Well, the retired Dominican boxer I'll ask about is Joan Guzman, who just recently got inducted to the New York Hall of Fame, where I did the speech.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Yeah. No, he was another outstanding fighter. Again, because of the situation that exists with multiple ties, he had a chance to be a champion and make money that he never would have been able to make before. Mm-hmm. But yes, Dominicans have become now will probably be the nucleus of New York fighters. If you want to look at the group that would support them, what they don't have, again, is the continuity every month to go out and support these guys because they don't fight as often as they should because we don't have promoters promoting regular shows on that basis. And you can't have promoters who say, if you want to be on my show, you got to sell 100 tickets. You got to basically pay me for the opportunity. Yeah. What kind of insanity is that? You don't become a waiter and pay to get the job.
No, I always make the argument. It's like, all right, nobody wants to buy tickets to see that guy fight. Well, that's your fault. Yes. You're the promoter.
Yes.
Like, you get what I'm saying? If he's not fighting, if he's not performing in the ring, then I could feel like, hey, man, like, you're not doing your job. They're not going to give you an opportunity. But if he's not selling tickets, that's something you're not doing. And that's an argument I've made multiple times with multiple promoters. And it's unfortunate that these promoters honestly seem lazy or stuck in their old ways, that they can't find new creative ways to attract people to arenas.
Well, this is the new way where you pay fighters to have to subsidize the fights. I had been involved with a fighter just fought recently in New York. He was fighting for a championship. The promoters, the main event, regional title. He said, "I'll give you $5,000 towards the promotion," and he paid the sanction fees. He paid the opponent $10,000. He paid the commissions. It cost that manager close to $20,000 just to put on this show, to put on the fight with no source of income. Here's the problem with boxing. Here's what we're missing. We are missing one class that we don't have is the billionaire class. Every other sport, the owner of the team or the franchise is a billionaire. they can afford to say, I'm going to invest $300 million in the Mets, and I'll lose $100 million the first 5 years to turn it around. Every promoter wants to make his living out of boxing. 99% of the owners, yes, they want an income, but they're willing to invest to develop it. I believe it's like I would believe it is a religion. If the owner of the Barclays Center and the owner of the Garden said, we're going to run a monthly show, we are going to invest $10 million or $15 million a year in this project, and we know that one basketball player gets that. They get more than that, but the lowest paid basketball players get that. And we'll run it. We'll take losses for 3 or 4 years until we can develop. We're going to have an average crowd of 6,000, 7,000. You could 100% do it, but you have to sustain losses, and you have to own the building. There's no reason Mr. Shui, who owns Barclays Center, or Dolan, who owns the Garden, cannot run boxing and do it successfully. I can't say you'll make a fortune the first year, but I'd go to heaven or hell on this, that they could not turn around and make money. They did it with the WNBA, which has lost hundreds of millions. They took it over. They turned it into a championship team that drew 17,000. 2 years ago, they were so bad, they sent them to White Plains County Center or Westchester County Center, drew them 4,000. But he invested the money to make him a champ. There's no way you couldn't do it in boxing, especially in New York. It's an impossibility to fail. Impossibility. But they have to get behind it.
Especially when you have the option of the Hulu theater,
Yes.
where you could develop the crowd there, and then once the man gets big for that room, then you know what, the next one's in the big room. I totally agree with you.
That was the idea. That was the minor league club to build it, and that's what they used it for. But they stopped because they stopped the continuity, and they have something these other people don't have. They own the building. When you got to rent a building, say it's $40,000 to rent a 3,000-seat arena. It's $125,000 to rent the Hulu on a one-shot basis. But if you're the Garden, say, "What we have the fighters, their TV rights are ours, not Eddie Hearn's, not Top Ranks, not someone else. We own that. So whatever we make all of the income, not just renting the building. And we own the building. So we need events in our building." They've got the perfect formula. They don't have the expertise, but you hire the people.
I don't think they have the expertise or the will.
That's the will. As I said, you need the money, the will, and the direction, which is so they have the money. They just need to have the will and the direction to do it.
All right.
But why they don't do it, that's the next rate of your program. You get them on here and ask them why. Yeah.
All right. I got a few last questions, and then we'll wrap it up. Alexander Usyk.
Yep.
He is an Olympic gold medalist, undisputed cruiserweight world champion, undisputed heavyweight world champion, and the way he wiped out heavyweight is super impressive to me. Beat Joshua twice, once in his home country, beats Fury twice, where he clearly cemented himself as the best heavyweight in the world. What is his legacy?
He's a great fighter. A great boxer will never have the legacy of a great puncher. We just mentioned Mike Tyson. We mentioned Jack Dempsey. Rocky Marciano goes into that same thing.
Yeah.
And what holds him back is somebody once said, in order to be famous, you have to be famous in America. And unfortunately, what works against him is he's not an American. Only because the United States dominates the media, the world media, the Western media. He's a Russian. He would be big. He's a great fighter. He's a great fighter for boxing fans. He's the dominant heavyweight. He'll go into the Hall of Fame first ballot. It's hard to know because he hasn't got the charisma of a Mike Tyson. If you and I open a place, we're giving out autographs. He's going to be here to sign him, Alexander Usyk. And down the block, they're giving out autographs of Mike Tyson. But those autographs are going to cost you $20. And Usyk is signing them for nothing. You'd have a line around the block for Mike Tyson to get those autographs.
Wow.
He's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful fighter. Great. But I think the charisma, that's not doubting his ability, sort of like Mayweather to a degree. People are like, well, tell me what he's done wrong. Nothing. It's just that he's not Muhammad Ali. He's like, now me have the greatest personality in Ukraine or when he speaks Russian, but it doesn't transcend. And the style in the ring is something that they want guys who hit home runs. They want guys who score the touchdowns. The technical people always suffer. That doesn't diminish their ability. Fantastic, wonderful ability. Yes.
I wouldn't forgive myself if this wasn't the last question. So I said that was my last question. I'll ask this. You are someone who's watched way more fights than me. What is the greatest fight of all time?
Oh, the greatest fight. Well, the greatest event I've ever been to in my lifetime in boxing is the first Ali Frazier. Ali Frazier won fight. And nothing ever, for me, again, you're young and impressionable. I was 20. Nothing compares to that. You know, I remember that. I remember Johnny Addy, and they brought up, when they introduced in the ring, they said, look, it's our, we bring up fighters, and let's bring up Rocky Graziano and Jake LaMotta and Willie Pep and Jersey Joe Walker. So we got 3 more. Here he is the Manasseh Moore, the former heavy. Jack Dempsey, place explodes. You can hardly hear them. And then he said, we got, here he is, the Brown Bomb, 25 defense, the Brown Bomb. But like the roof was blowing off, and they had 21,000. You couldn't get with an eyedropper anymore in there. All right, one more, the hometown boy, 5-time middleweight. He didn't finish the words. Sugar, boom, like an atom bomb. Sugar Ray Robinson. He says, okay, sometimes we announce celebrities, but everybody's here tonight. And Johnny I goes, hiya, Frank. Frank Sinatra was taking pictures for Ring Mike. Hiya, Frank. Shakes his hands. He said, let's go. 15 rounds for the undisputed, undefeated heavyweight championship. That was it.
Oh,
unforgettable.
I could only imagine. How'd you manage to get tickets for that fight?
I got tickets for a guy who was a bookmaker named, we used to call him, his name was Mike, and English we called him, and he had a friend, Billy Brown was a matchmaker, and his brother was a ticket broker at the Astor Hotel, which is no longer, the Abbey Victoria, no longer there, and I got a $25 ticket. And I remember paying $10. It was $35, and debating in my mind, should I give him 10? Ooh, that's no. That ticket you couldn't buy for the weight in gold. I remember going into the arena, and it was guys. I know it's a big event. Kurt Jurgens is here. This obscure actor. Well, he was the name of him. And I came down a service elevator with Gene Tunney, and not Gene Tunney, with Gene Kelly. I said, Mr. Kelly, you like the fight? He said, it was a good one, yeah.
How were the seats? How were the 20?
I was upstairs. But I'll tell you what happened. I snuck down. This is my story, but it has an anecdote. And in those days, you could wiggle your way down. When you was a kid, you did it, and all the ushers knew you. Yeah. So I went down, and I sat there were the steps above the ringside, and I squeezed in. There were no seats. And in front of me, there was Aretha Franklin, and she had a hat on, this like a conical hat. Now, I was on the stairs. I wasn't there. But all the ushers didn't, because they were sitting down watching the fight. And the guy behind her was saying, take off that hat. You wouldn't do it. Take off that hat. And he says, I paid $100 for the seat. Take off that damn hat. And his buddy nudges him. That's Aretha Franklin. He said, I don't get the damn, who the hell she is? Take off that goddamn hat. I spent $100 for the seat. She wouldn't take off the hat. And the guy had this, like this. Like that, but she wouldn't take off that hat. But so I went down there. I wasn't at ringside. I was above it. I sat on the step. I remember that. What a fight. It was great. I mean, you never had 2 undefeated champions, 2 Olympic gold medals, the 2 absolutes, like 2 gunfights. Everybody else was shot, and they come and face each other. And it's, I don't know, Wyatt Earp versus Wild Bill Hickok. There was no one else to showdown. And they had beaten, Frazier had beaten Foster and Ellis and Quarry, and Al had beaten Bonavena in the last generation, Patterson. There was nobody. They were the last men standing, and they were at their best. And Frazier gave the fight of his life, and it was great.
Well, Don, I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you.
Maybe we can do this again sometime. I hope you enjoyed yourself.
Oh, it was wonderful. It's great to be with somebody who likes boxing, because you get there with some people, or I'll push through the conversation.
No.
A heavy cart up a hill. No, you're wonderful.
No. Thank you so much.
Thanks. We'll see you at the fights.
All right. Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.